In the beginning, there is no crown, no banner, no triumphant march of armies. There is only darkness, and the slow, deliberate movement of fire. A single torch hisses as it touches the damp air of a stone chamber. Its light crawls across rough walls, over shelves crowded with parchment, over ink faded by centuries. Somewhere in this room, names have been scratched out. Lines have been rewritten. A past has been quietly rearranged. This is not how history usually introduces itself. We are taught to expect clarity. Dates, victories, coronations, the rise and fall of kings. But some stories do not announce themselves. Some are hidden on purpose. And the deeper one looks into the foundations of Europe, the more one senses that something essential is missing. Not lost by accident, but removed. For more than 1,000 years, Europe has told a familiar story about its origins. Rome fell. Chaos followed. New kingdoms rose from the ruins. Among them was the kingdom of the Franks, a rough, violent world that slowly transformed into medieval France. In this story, one dynasty fades naturally, replaced by a stronger, more capable one. Progress marches on. Order is restored. But history rarely moves so cleanly. Beneath the official narrative lies a quieter current, one that scholars, chroniclers, and dreamers have brushed against for centuries. It is the suggestion that Europe's first royal bloodline was not merely overthrown, but deliberately erased. That its memory posed a threat not only to rival kings, but to the very institutions that claimed moral authority over the continent. This is the story of the Merovingians. At first glance, they appear unimpressive. Their portraits are crude. Their reigns are poorly documented. Medieval writers dismiss their later kings as weak, idle, unworthy of respect. Even their name feels distant, half-forgotten, buried beneath the louder legacy of those who came after. And yet, the more one examines the Merovingians, the more unsettling the picture becomes. Why were these kings remembered so poorly, when others far more brutal were celebrated? Why do their chronicles feel incomplete, interrupted, strangely evasive? Why does their dynasty seem wrapped in myth, whispered about rather than clearly described? Most dynasties fall because they lose power. The Merovingians lost something else first: their story. In the centuries after their disappearance, European rulers would work tirelessly to establish legitimacy through blood, law, and divine approval. They traced genealogies back to heroes, saints, even biblical figures. Bloodlines became proof of destiny. And yet, one bloodline older than most was treated differently. Its origins were mythologized. Its end was sanitized. Its very name became associated with decay and irrelevance. This alone would be suspicious. But the Merovingians were not an ordinary family elevated by chance. From the moment they emerge in the historical record, they are described in strange terms. Their founders are said to descend not simply from warriors, but from something otherworldly. Their kings ruled not just with swords, but with symbols. Even their bodies were considered sacred. Long hair for them was not fashion. It was authority made visible. To cut it was to destroy legitimacy itself. In a world where crowns could be seized and thrones overturned, the Merovingian body carried power that could not be easily transferred. That kind of belief does not arise accidentally. It comes from deep cultural memory, from older systems of kingship where rule was inherited not just through blood, but through something closer to sanctity. This is where discomfort begins. Because Europe's later order, particularly the Christian order that reshaped the continent, depended on a very specific idea of authority. Power was to flow from God through the church and only then to kings. Legitimacy was granted, not embodied. A ruler ruled because he was chosen, anointed, approved. A bloodline that claimed power by its very existence disrupted that structure. And so, from the shadows of monasteries and royal courts, a quieter conflict unfolded. Not always with armies, but with words, with chronicles, with omissions. When the Merovingians finally disappear from the throne, the event is described as almost administrative. A weak king is removed. His hair is cut. He is sent to a monastery. A new dynasty takes over, blessed by religious authority. There is no great war, no dramatic collapse. History moves on. But history often hides its most violent acts behind calm language. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was not a symbolic insult. It was a ritual killing of identity. He was left alive, but stripped of meaning. Sealed away, not to be remembered, not to be mourned. This was not the end of a family. It was an erasure. An erasure leaves traces. In the centuries that followed, stories began to circulate at the edges of official history. Legends of sacred bloodlines, tales of kings who ruled by ancient right, myths of holy descendants hidden among ordinary people. These stories appeared again and again, reshaped for new audiences, adapted to new fears. They were dismissed as fantasy, as superstition. But their persistence raises an unsettling question. Why did Europe keep imagining lost royal blood? Perhaps because something unresolved remained buried beneath its foundations. The Merovingians ruled at a moment when the old world had not yet fully died. Roman order had collapsed, but Christian order was still forming. Pagan memory lingered alongside new faith. In that fragile space, power meant more than control of land. It meant control of meaning. Whoever defined the past could shape the future. The dynasty that replaced the Merovingians understood this well. They did not merely take the throne. They rewrote the story. They portrayed their predecessors as failures, as kings who slept while others governed. They framed their rise as necessity, even salvation. And the church, gaining stability and influence, found little reason to disagree. Over time, repetition hardened into truth. By the High Middle Ages, the Merovingians were no longer dangerous. They were irrelevant. Their myths were curiosities. Their kings footnotes. The threat they once posed had been neutralized not through destruction, but through forgetting. Yet forgetting is never perfect. Manuscripts survived. Symbols endured. Names resurfaced in unexpected places. And in moments of crisis, when authority was questioned, Europe's imagination returned again and again to the idea of a hidden lineage, a rightful bloodline waiting beneath the surface of history. This documentary is not an attempt to resurrect fantasy or to claim secret rulers behind modern power. It is something quieter, and perhaps more unsettling. It is an examination of how history chooses what to remember and what to bury, of how blood, belief, and power intersected at the birth of medieval Europe, and of why one family's story was considered too dangerous to be told plainly. The Merovingian secret is not a single revelation locked away in a vault. It is a pattern, a silence, a series of choices made by those who survived and wrote the past. And as we begin this journey, one question hangs in the darkness of that candlelit chamber, heavier than any crown. If the Merovingians were truly nothing more than failed kings, why did Europe work so hard to make us forget them? The world into which the Merovingians emerged was not yet ready to be called medieval. It was a land suspended between endings and beginnings, where the old rules still echoed but no longer held. Roman roads cracked beneath weeds. Stone villas stood half-abandoned, their mosaics fading under drifting ash and rain. Authority, once absolute and unquestioned, now survived only in memory and habit. This was not the fall of a civilization in a single moment, but a long, uneven unraveling. Gaul, the territory that would one day become France, had been Roman for centuries. Its people spoke Latin, worshipped Roman gods before slowly adopting Christianity, and lived under laws written far away. Even when emperors grew weak, the idea of Rome remained strong. To live under Roman order was to believe that someone, somewhere, was still in control. By the 5th century, that belief was fading. Imperial officials withdrew. Armies stopped arriving. Tax systems collapsed into local arrangements. Cities shrank, their walls enclosing fewer and fewer lives. In the countryside, survival mattered more than loyalty to distant emperors. Into this uncertainty came new peoples, labeled by Roman writers as barbarians, though many had lived alongside Rome for generations. They served as soldiers, traders, settlers. They were both outsiders and inheritors. Among them were the Franks. The Franks were not a single tribe marching with one purpose. They were a loose network of groups bound by language, custom and shared enemies. Some had fought for Rome. Others had fought against it. Many had done both. They crossed the Rhine not as invaders in the traditional sense, but as participants in a world already coming apart. What made the Franks different was not their strength alone, but their timing. They arrived when no single authority could fully resist them, yet enough Roman structure remained to be seized and repurposed. Forts became strongholds. Titles were adopted. Roman practices were blended with older customs. The Franks did not destroy Rome's legacy in Gaul. They occupied its ruins and claimed them as their own. Power in this world was deeply personal. There were no strong institutions left to enforce order across large territories. Loyalty was owed to individuals, not abstract states. Kings were war leaders, judges, and symbols all at once. Their legitimacy came from victory, generosity, and ancestry. To rule was to convince others that your rule made sense in a chaotic world. This is why blood mattered. In the absence of stable law, lineage became a form of proof. A man who could trace his descent to a respected ancestor carried inherited authority. Memory replaced bureaucracy. Story replaced statute. To forget one's lineage was to risk losing one's place in the fragile hierarchy of power. Yet lineage alone was not enough. The late Roman world had also inherited Christianity, a faith that promised order beyond violence. Bishops, often the only educated figures left in cities, became mediators, record keepers, and moral authorities. Churches offered continuity where imperial offices had vanished. For many communities, the church was the last visible remnant of a universal system. This created a tension that would define early medieval Europe. On one side stood warrior kings, ruling through blood, loyalty, and force. On the other stood religious authority, claiming legitimacy through divine will and moral law. Both needed each other. Kings needed blessing. Bishops needed protection. But neither fully trusted the other. It was into this unstable balance that the Merovingians would rise. Before they became kings, they were war leaders among many. Their early ancestors appear briefly, almost obscurely, in the historical record. Their names are uncertain, their deeds fragmentary. Yet even at this stage, something about them stands out. Later chroniclers would attribute to them origins that were not merely noble, but strange. Their lineage was said to reach back into a time before Rome, before Christianity, into a realm where myth and memory overlapped. This was not unusual in itself. Many ruling families claimed legendary ancestors. But the persistence and seriousness with which Merovingian origins were treated suggests something deeper than simple propaganda. These stories were not always flattering. They were unsettling. They hinted at power that was inherited, not granted. As Roman authority collapsed further, the competition for dominance intensified. Rival warlords fought for control of cities, river crossings, and fertile land. Alliances shifted constantly. Violence was personal, brutal, and frequent. In this environment, stability was rare and highly valued. A king who could impose order even briefly was worth following. But stability required more than victory. It required belief. People needed to believe that a ruler's authority was natural, inevitable, perhaps even sacred. Without that belief, loyalty dissolved as soon as fortune turned. This is why kingship in this period was as much symbolic as it was military. The Merovingians seemed to understand this instinctively. They did not present themselves simply as conquerors. They embodied continuity in a world afraid of change. Their rule suggested that chaos could be inherited, shaped, and controlled through blood. This idea resonated deeply with populations exhausted by uncertainty. Yet beneath the surface, something else was forming. Christianity, though still fragile in many regions, was organizing itself. Bishops corresponded. Councils met. Doctrine hardened. The church was learning how to survive without empire, and in doing so, it discovered a new role, the guardian of legitimacy. Whoever the church recognized could claim to rule not just by force, but by God's will. This presented both opportunity and danger for early kings. A ruler who secured the church's support gained access to literacy, administration, and moral authority. But in return, he accepted a framework in which kingship was conditional. A king ruled because he was chosen by God, interpreted through the church. His blood alone was not enough. For a dynasty rooted in inherited, almost mystical authority, this posed a challenge. As the Merovingians consolidated power, they stood at a crossroads between worlds. Behind them lay older traditions of sacred kingship, where the ruler's body and lineage carried meaning beyond law. Ahead lay a Christian future in which authority would be regulated, blessed, and eventually constrained by religious institutions. The choices made in this moment would echo for centuries. Gaul itself was changing. Latin slowly evolved into early Romance languages. Pagan shrines gave way to churches, though old practices lingered quietly in rural life. Roman law mixed with Germanic custom, producing new legal traditions that valued compensation over punishment, kinship over state. This hybrid world was unstable but fertile. It allowed for new dynasties to define themselves not as destroyers of Rome, but as its heirs. To rule Gaul was not merely to conquer land. It was to claim the memory of civilization itself. The Merovingians would do exactly that. They would present themselves as kings of a people and a place in transition, offering continuity without complete submission to either Roman past or Christian future. Their rise would feel inevitable to those living through it. Order, after all, is most convincing when it arrives quietly. Yet this very position made them vulnerable. A dynasty that draws authority from blood, memory, and embodiment cannot easily be controlled. It does not rely solely on blessing or bureaucracy, and for institutions seeking long-term stability, such independence is unsettling. By the time the Merovingians reached the height of their power, the forces that would one day undermine them were already present. The church was growing more confident. Administrative roles were solidifying. New families were learning how to rule without appearing to rule. The stage was set. This was a world waiting for a dynasty that could bridge chaos and order. The Merovingians stepped into that role at precisely the right moment. But history rarely allows such balance to last. And the same conditions that made their rise possible would eventually make their fall seem necessary. The question is not why the Merovingians rose in this broken world. The deeper question is why, once order returned, that world decided it no longer needed to remember them. Long before the Merovingians appear clearly in history, before crowns and councils and baptisms, there is a story that does not behave like history at all. It does not offer dates or witnesses. It arrives instead as a whisper, half-recorded, half-dismissed, lingering at the edges of medieval chronicles like a dream that refuses to fade. This is the story of the Quinator. According to later writers, the Merovingian bloodline began with an encounter by the sea. A queen, already married to a Frankish king, was walking along the shore when she was approached by a strange being. Some called it a beast. Others called it a god. The Latin sources struggle to name it, settling on a term that feels deliberately vague. Quinator, a creature of 5 horns, neither fully animal nor fully human. After this encounter, the queen conceived a child. And from that child, the Merovingian kings were born. Modern readers often react with disbelief or amusement. It sounds like a crude myth, a primitive attempt to explain royal power through fantasy. Historians have long brushed it aside, treating it as metaphor or propaganda, an embarrassing relic of a less rational age. And yet, the story persists in serious sources, preserved rather than erased. That alone demands attention. Medieval chroniclers were selective. They omitted details that undermined Christian order. They reshaped pagan stories to fit new moral frameworks. If the Quinator legend were merely foolish, it could have been removed. Instead, it was recorded, cautiously, almost reluctantly, as though the writer felt compelled to preserve it despite discomfort. This raises an important question. Why would a Christian chronicler preserve a story suggesting that a royal bloodline descended from something monstrous or divine? One possibility is that the story was never meant to be taken literally. In the ancient world, monstrous ancestry often symbolized liminality, the crossing of boundaries. Creatures like centaurs, minotaurs, and sea beasts existed between categories. They represented power that did not fit neatly into human or divine order. To claim descent from such a being was not to admit shame, but to assert exceptionality. The sea itself carries meaning here. In early European mythology, the sea was not simply water. It was chaos, mystery, origin. Life emerged from it. Threats came from it. To be seaborne was to come from a place beyond human control. Kings linked to the sea were often seen as chosen, marked by forces older than land-based authority. The Merovingian origin story situates their power precisely there, outside the normal chain of human inheritance. This kind of myth was not invented lightly. Dynasties used ancestral stories strategically. A noble family might trace its line to a Roman senator, a Trojan hero, or a biblical patriarch. These claims connected them to respected traditions. The Merovingians, by contrast, were linked to something unsettling. Their origin was not clean, not entirely respectable by Christian standards, which suggests the story may not have been designed for Christian approval. Instead, it may preserve an older Frankish belief about kingship, one that predates Christianity and Roman law. In many pre-Christian European societies, kings were seen as mediators between worlds. They embodied fertility, protection, and cosmic balance. Their legitimacy came not from election or blessing, but from their nature. A king ruled because he was different. In such systems, the body of the king mattered deeply. Physical markers, ritual behaviors, and ancestral myths all reinforced the idea that the ruler was set apart. The Merovingians' long hair, later so emphasized, fits perfectly into this worldview. Hair symbolized vitality, strength, continuity. To cut it was to break the chain between past and present. The Quinator legend functions in the same way. It marks the dynasty as other, not merely human rulers elevated by chance, but bearers of an ancient force that could not be replicated. Christian writers, encountering this tradition, faced a dilemma. To erase it entirely would risk alienating populations who still remembered these beliefs. To embrace it openly would undermine Christian theology. The compromise was preservation with discomfort. The story was recorded, but not explained. Mentioned, but not celebrated. Over time, its meaning shifted. As Christianity spread and consolidated power, such myths became increasingly problematic. A bloodline descended from a quasi-divine sea creature conflicted with the Church's insistence that all authority came from the Christian God alone. Sacred ancestry had to be reinterpreted or neutralized. This may explain why later Merovingian kings were depicted as weak, foolish, or morally compromised. If their sacred origins could not be denied outright, their practical worth could be questioned. Myth without power becomes curiosity. Sacred blood without authority becomes superstition. Yet even as official narratives diminished them, the underlying idea refused to disappear. Across medieval Europe, stories circulated of royal bloodlines hidden among the people, of kings who would return, of families marked by destiny rather than office. These stories appear in different forms, in different regions, but they share a common theme. True authority lies in lineage, not in crowns granted by institutions. The Merovingian myth fits seamlessly into this pattern. It is also worth noting what the Quinator is not. It is not named as a demon. It is not explicitly evil. It is ambiguous. This ambiguity is crucial. It suggests that the story predates the Christian moral framework that would later categorize supernatural beings as either angels or demons. Instead, the Quinator belongs to a world where power existed on a spectrum. Nature itself was alive, dangerous, and sacred. Kings emerged from this world as its representatives. By preserving the story, even reluctantly, medieval writers acknowledged that the Merovingians were rooted in something older than Christian kingship. Something that could not be fully explained, only hinted at. This creates a tension at the heart of their legacy. On one hand, the Merovingians would become Christian kings, baptized, crowned, and celebrated as defenders of the faith. On the other, their origin story suggested that their authority did not originate with the Church, came from elsewhere. Such a claim was manageable as long as the dynasty remained useful. But once rivals emerged who could offer power without myth, blessing without ambiguity, the old stories became liabilities. It is telling that the Quinator legend fades from prominence just as the Merovingians lose real power. It does not vanish entirely, but it retreats into footnotes and obscure passages. The beast returns to the sea, so to speak, leaving behind a dynasty increasingly stripped of its mystique. Yet myths do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. They sink into collective memory, waiting to resurface in new forms. The Merovingian origin story reminds us that early medieval Europe did not draw clear lines between history and myth. Both served the same purpose, to explain why some ruled and others obeyed. When we dismiss such stories too quickly, we risk misunderstanding how power was understood by those who lived under it. The Quinator may never have existed as a literal creature, but as an idea it tells us something essential. It tells us that the Merovingians were seen, and perhaps saw themselves, as heirs to a kind of authority that could not be taught or transferred. They were born into it, and that belief, more than any monster, may explain why later generations found it necessary not just to overthrow them, but to reduce their origins to myth. Because a dynasty that claims power from the deep past, from forces older than church and state, does not merely challenge kings. It challenges the story of civilization itself. Among the many strange details that surround the Merovingian kings, none is more striking, or more easily overlooked, than their hair. Medieval sources return to it again and again, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with unease. These were the long-haired kings, a phrase that appears so often it begins to feel less like description and more like definition. To understand the Merovingians, one must understand why something as simple as hair carried such extraordinary weight. In the early medieval world, the body was not separate from authority. Power was not abstract. It lived in flesh, gesture, and ritual. A king's presence mattered as much as his commands. His physical form was a symbol, a living expression of order in a fragile world. The Merovingians embodied this idea more completely than any dynasty that followed. Their hair was not cut short like that of ordinary men. It flowed long over their shoulders, carefully maintained, publicly visible. This was not vanity. It was declaration. Long hair marked them as different from warriors, peasants, even nobles. It marked them as kings by nature, not by appointment. This belief did not arise in isolation. Across many ancient cultures, hair symbolized strength, vitality, and continuity. In the Hebrew Bible, Samson's power resided in his uncut hair. Among Germanic peoples, hair was associated with honor and freedom. To shear someone was to shame them, to strip them of identity. For the Merovingians, hair went even further. It was the visible sign of their sacred lineage. To cut it was not merely to humiliate a king. It was to end him. This is why the punishment reserved for defeated Merovingian rulers was so specific. They were not usually executed. They were tonsured. Their hair was cut, and they were sent to monasteries, removed from public life but kept alive. On the surface, this appeared merciful. In reality, it was absolute annihilation. A Merovingian without long hair was no longer a king, even if he still breathed. This practice reveals a great deal about how kingship was understood at the time. Authority was not housed solely in institutions or titles. It resided in the body itself. The king's hair connected him to his ancestors, to the origin myth of the dynasty, to the idea that rulership flowed through blood in a visible, almost tangible way. When later dynasties dismissed Merovingian kings as weak or idle, they ignored this deeper truth. Even stripped of practical power, these kings remained dangerous symbols. As long as they lived, with hair uncut, they represented an alternative form of legitimacy. That is why they had to be neutralized so carefully. The Church, in particular, found this kind of embodied authority troubling. Christian theology emphasized humility, obedience, and the separation of the spiritual from the physical. Power was meant to be conferred through ritual and blessing, not inherited through the body itself. A king whose authority was literally grown, not granted, existed outside this framework. The long hair of the Merovingians could not be easily Christianized. It was not a sacrament. It was not bestowed by clergy. It simply was. Early attempts were made to reinterpret it. Some writers suggested it was merely a custom, an old-fashioned style. Others hinted that it symbolized nobility or ancestral pride. But these explanations feel insufficient when placed alongside the consistent ritual importance of haircutting in moments of political transition. When Merovingian kings fell, their hair fell with them. This is where the human cost of symbolic power becomes visible. Imagine a child born into this dynasty. From the moment of birth, his hair marked him as different. His identity, his destiny was written into his body. He did not grow into kingship. It grew with him. Every passing year, every lengthening strand reinforced who he was meant to be. To lose that hair was not merely to lose a throne. It was to lose oneself. Monastic life, for a tonsured Merovingian, was not a peaceful retirement. It was a living death. Stripped of the very feature that made him who he was, he existed in a space of negation. Neither king nor commoner, neither ruler nor martyr. He was a reminder of a past that others wished to forget. This strategy was cruel in its effectiveness. It avoided bloodshed while achieving erasure. A dead king could inspire loyalty, revenge, or legend. A living king reduced to nothing inspired silence. Over time, this practice reshaped how later generations understood Merovingian history. Because the dynasty did not end in dramatic slaughter, its fall seemed natural, almost gentle. There was no great tragedy to remember, no battlefield soaked in royal blood, just a quiet transfer of power. But silence can be more violent than noise. The focus on hair also reveals how deeply pre-Christian ideas persisted beneath the surface of early medieval Europe. Sacred kingship did not vanish overnight with conversion. It lingered in customs, symbols, and unspoken beliefs. The Merovingians stood at the crossroads of these worlds, embodying a form of authority that was already becoming uncomfortable. Later dynasties learned from this discomfort. They distanced kingship from the body. Crowns replaced hair. Rituals replaced ancestry. Authority became something that could be given and taken away by institutions. In this sense, the fall of the long-haired kings marks a turning point in European political thought. Power was no longer something one simply was. It became something one held, conditionally. And yet, the memory of embodied authority never fully disappeared. Stories of rightful kings in disguise, of heirs marked by birth rather than proclamation, recur throughout European folklore. The idea that true rulers can be recognized not by ceremony, but by nature itself, continues to haunt the imagination. The Merovingians, with their uncut hair and sacred lineage, became the prototype for these stories. Even in forgetting them, Europe remembered the idea they represented. It is telling that when later chroniclers sought to explain Merovingian decline, they focused on moral weakness rather than symbolic destruction. They spoke of laziness, incompetence, indulgence. These were safe explanations. They avoided confronting the deeper rupture, the deliberate dismantling of a form of kingship that no longer fit the emerging order. Hair, in this context, becomes a quiet witness to historical transformation. Something so personal, so physical, carries the weight of ideological change. The scissors that cut a Merovingian's hair were not merely tools of grooming. They were instruments of a new world. By the time the dynasty vanished from power, its most visible symbol had already been neutralized. The long-haired kings became a memory, then a curiosity, then a footnote. But symbols have long lives. To this day, the image of the Merovingian king, hair flowing, half legend, half history, unsettles the clean lines of medieval narrative. He does not fit easily into the story of progress from chaos to order. He reminds us that there were other ways of understanding authority, other paths not taken. And perhaps that is why his hair had to be cut. Because as long as it remained unshorn, it testified to a kind of power that could not be controlled, only erased. In the chaotic years following the collapse of Roman authority in Gaul, a single figure began to emerge from the shadows of fragmented history. Clovis, the man who would unite the Frankish tribes and lay the foundations of what would become medieval France. His story is at once heroic and deeply unsettling, a tale of ambition, violence, and the extraordinary intersection of fate and faith. Clovis's life would redefine kingship, not only for his dynasty but for the entire European continent. And yet it began with uncertainty, with a world teetering on the edge of dissolution. The early life of Clovis is veiled in fragments and legend. Born into the Merovingian line, he inherited a legacy that was as much myth as reality. Stories claimed his descent from ancestors touched by the supernatural, whispers of the Quinator, and the sacred bloodline that had persisted in secrecy. From birth, his identity was shaped by a combination of inherited power and the expectations of a fractured people longing for unity. As a young prince, Clovis was thrust into a turbulent environment. Rival Frankish tribes vied for dominance, Roman institutions lingered only as faded remnants, and Christianity was gaining ground, offering moral authority and social cohesion to those willing to embrace it. Clovis's early campaigns reveal a calculated understanding of both human and divine politics. He did not merely conquer by force. He negotiated alliances, employed diplomacy, and exploited rivalries. These actions were guided by a keen sense of timing and perception. A single decisive victory or a carefully cultivated alliance could transform a fractious collection of tribes into a single kingdom. Clovis understood that power, while rooted in violence, also relied on legitimacy, a legitimacy that would become intertwined with faith in ways that would shock his contemporaries. The defining moment in Clovis's life, and perhaps the turning point for the Merovingian dynasty, came with his conversion to Christianity. Unlike many of his predecessors and contemporaries, Clovis did not simply tolerate the Christian faith. He embraced it publicly, strategically, and irreversibly. According to the chroniclers, before a crucial battle against the Alemanni, Clovis vowed that if God granted him victory, he would convert and be baptized. This was more than a political maneuver. It was a fusion of personal conviction, calculated risk, and the leveraging of divine authority to consolidate earthly power. Victory followed, and with it, a dramatic public baptism that symbolized not only his personal faith but the integration of his dynasty into a Christian Europe. This conversion carried profound implications. Clovis did not merely adopt the religion of his subjects. He positioned himself as a king chosen by God, a ruler whose legitimacy was sanctified through baptism and anointment. In doing so, he aligned the Merovingian bloodline with the moral and spiritual authority of the Church, creating a bond that would endure for centuries. It also set a precedent. Kingship in this emerging medieval order would no longer be purely hereditary or martial. It would be inseparable from religious sanction. Clovis became a model of the ideal Christian ruler, a template for the synthesis of political, military, and spiritual power. Yet this alliance between bloodline and faith was not without tension. The Church, though grateful for Clovis's conversion, remained wary of dynasties whose power was rooted in sacred ancestry as much as in moral authority. Clovis himself had inherited a lineage imbued with pre-Christian significance, a line whose kings had been seen as embodiments of divine or supernatural authority. By integrating the sacred bloodline with Christian legitimacy, Clovis created a dual foundation of power, one visible to all through ritual and church sanction, and one hidden, ancient, almost mystical, encoded in the body, in the lineage, and in the traditions of the Frankish people. This duality was reflected in Clovis's actions as king. He was both a conqueror and a legislator, a warrior and a judge. He codified laws, blending Roman precedents with Frankish custom, producing what would become the Salic law, a legal framework that emphasized both kinship and authority. He centralized power without destroying local structures, understanding that stability required a delicate balance between coercion and consent. Every battle he fought, every law he enacted, reinforced the idea that his authority was both absolute and divinely sanctioned, a fusion of inherited legitimacy and active governance. The emotional resonance of Clovis's reign cannot be understated. For the people of Gaul, he was more than a king. He was a symbol of continuity in a world where memory and tradition were fragile. His victories offered security, his conversion offered moral clarity, and his leadership embodied the hope that fractured communities could be united. But the stakes were high. Failure meant not only personal defeat but the potential collapse of the fragile political and religious order. In this context, every act of governance carried existential weight. Every decision shaped the lives of thousands, and every alliance had to be meticulously calculated. Clovis's marriage alliances further illustrate the intertwining of power and strategy. He married members of influential families, securing bonds that extended his influence and reinforced his legitimacy. These unions were more than personal arrangements. They were political instruments designed to cement loyalty, prevent rebellion, and integrate diverse peoples under a single rule. They also ensured that the Merovingian bloodline would continue to carry both symbolic and practical authority, blending heritage with realpolitik in a way that few rulers had achieved before him. Even as Clovis consolidated power, he faced challenges from both within and without. Rival Frankish leaders tested his claims. Local aristocrats resisted centralization. Pagan traditions persisted alongside the newly dominant Christian faith, creating pockets of tension and unrest. Through it all, Clovis navigated with a combination of decisiveness, calculated risk, and a keen understanding of human psychology. His ability to manipulate perception, to blend fear, loyalty, and awe, allowed him to maintain authority in a landscape where kings often rose and fell within years. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Clovis is not simply territorial conquest or legal codification, but the psychological transformation he effected. By embracing Christianity and presenting his rule as divinely sanctioned, he changed the way people perceived authority. Kings were no longer merely warriors or hereditary heirs. They became instruments of divine order, mediators between God and people. This redefinition of power had consequences far beyond his reign, shaping European monarchy for centuries to come. Yet the story of Clovis is also a reminder of the precariousness of such power. Authority built on both blood and faith is inherently unstable, because it depends on perception, belief, and continuous performance. While Clovis himself embodied these ideals with skill, his successors would struggle to maintain the same balance. The tension between inherited sacredness and sanctioned authority would grow, setting the stage for the later marginalization and eventual erasure of the Merovingian kings. In examining Clovis, one sees the complexity of kingship in early medieval Europe. He was at once violent and devout, pragmatic and symbolic, a man whose personal destiny intertwined inexorably with the fate of an entire people. His victories were not only physical but ideological, creating a model of rule that blended ancestry, martial skill, and religious legitimacy in a way that few leaders before him had attempted. And yet, as we look back from the distant future, we see the fragile threads of that power beginning to fray. The alliance between dynasty and church, so carefully cultivated, would eventually become a tool for the dynasty's own suppression. The sacred bloodline that Clovis strengthened would, within a few generations, be rendered politically irrelevant, its power neutralized, its story quietly rewritten. Clovis's baptism, his battles, his marriages, and his laws are more than historical events. They are the moments when myth, faith, and politics converged to shape the trajectory of Europe. They are evidence that the Merovingians were not simply kings. They were symbols of an older, more mysterious order that had survived the collapse of Rome and sought to adapt to the emerging Christian world. And it is this convergence of blood, belief, and ambition that makes Clovis and the early Merovingians so compelling. They were men of flesh and myth, warriors and sacred heirs, bound together by a lineage whose power was as much visible as it was invisible, as much feared as it was revered. In the end, Clovis's story leaves us with a haunting question. In uniting the Franks and embracing a new faith, did he secure his dynasty's immortality, or did he inadvertently plant the seeds of its erasure? Perhaps the most astonishing part of the Merovingian legacy is that both could be true simultaneously, like light and shadow intertwined, shaping the history of Europe for centuries to come. The alliance between the Merovingian kings and the Christian Church was one of the most consequential yet understated aspects of early medieval Europe. It was not merely a marriage of convenience, but a complex, sometimes uneasy pact that intertwined spiritual authority with temporal power in ways that would shape centuries of history. For the Merovingians, it offered legitimacy and protection. For the Church, it offered stability, influence, and a new mechanism to extend its moral and political reach across a fractured continent. But beneath this seeming harmony lay tension, compromise, and an understanding that the power of a dynasty rooted in sacred blood could never be entirely trusted or controlled. When Clovis converted to Christianity, it was more than a personal act of faith. It was a statement to his subjects, to rival tribes, and to the bishops who wielded authority in cities and towns across Gaul. By aligning himself with the church, Clovis positioned the Merovingian dynasty as a divinely sanctioned ruling line, a protector of the faith, and an exemplar of Christian kingship. This act of alignment was both visionary and tactical. It demonstrated that a king could draw authority not only from his own bloodline and military victories, but also from the moral and spiritual sanction of the church. Yet the church's acceptance of Clovis and his successors was not unconditional. Bishops and clerics had their own priorities, including the preservation of ecclesiastical influence and the spread of Christian doctrine. They needed rulers who could enforce order, secure lands, and protect church property. In exchange, they would confer religious legitimacy upon kings whose authority might otherwise have been contested. But this was a delicate balance. Kings like Clovis possessed sacred heritage predating Christian authority, rooted in myths, symbols, and bloodlines older than the church itself. The church benefited from their rule but remained wary of a dynasty whose power was not entirely derived from ecclesiastical sanction. This tension became a defining feature of Merovingian rule. The kings needed the church to cement their authority among people who were increasingly Christian but still held onto older beliefs. In return, the church needed the kings to enforce its moral and social frameworks, but without allowing the dynasty's mystical heritage to overshadow the institution itself. This interdependence created a subtle struggle. Both parties required each other to survive, yet each remained cautious about granting too much freedom. The balance of power was never static. It shifted with each new ruler, each council, each political upheaval. Marriage and family were central to this pact. Merovingian queens, often accused by chroniclers of cruelty or cunning, were key players in maintaining the dynasty's connection to both sacred ancestry and the church. Women like Brunhilde and Fredegund did more than act as consorts. They safeguarded bloodlines, managed dynastic succession, and maintained political alliances that reinforced the king's legitimacy. Their roles demonstrate that the pact between dynasty and church was not solely about male rulers. It encompassed the entire household, extending the reach of sacred and temporal power. Yet, as history often shows, these women were vulnerable to the same forces of erasure that would later diminish the Merovingians. When their influence became threatening, chroniclers demonized them, and their contributions were obscured, a subtle reminder of how narratives could be manipulated to serve the surviving power structure. The sacredness of the Merovingian bloodline itself complicated the alliance with the church. Unlike later dynasties whose legitimacy could be granted or revoked by coronation or anointment, the Merovingians carried an inherent authority, visible in their bodies, in their long hair, and in the myths that surrounded their lineage. This authority was not fully subject to ecclesiastical control. A king might be advised by bishops, but he was also a living symbol of a sacred right that predated Christian institutions. This made the dynasty simultaneously useful and potentially threatening to church leaders, who had to navigate a path between endorsement and containment. The alliance was also tested in the political realm. The Merovingians faced internal revolts, rival claimants, and external invasions, all of which required the church's support for effective resolution. Bishops could legitimize rulership, mobilize followers, and stabilize regions through moral authority. At the same time, kings like Clovis used these crises to demonstrate loyalty to the church, reinforcing their own power and ensuring that their mystical ancestry did not become a liability. Every military victory, legal reform, and political maneuver was carefully calibrated to honor the pact while asserting the dynasty's independence. Over time, however, the relationship between the Merovingians and the church began to shift. As the dynasty weakened, the balance of power increasingly favored the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Do-nothing kings emerged, as later chroniclers described, whose authority depended less on personal rule and more on church recognition and the work of powerful officials like the mayors of the palace. The church maintained continuity while kings became symbols rather than active rulers. This transition demonstrates that alliances based on mutual benefit can evolve, sometimes in ways that undermine one of the original partners. Despite these changes, the early alliance between the Merovingians and the Church left a lasting imprint on European governance. It established the principle that spiritual endorsement could legitimize temporal authority, creating a model for later kings who would seek papal approval and religious blessing for their rule. The Merovingians themselves became a case study in the delicate balance of power between inherited sacredness and institutional sanction, a lesson that would echo throughout the medieval period. At the heart of this pact lay an emotional dimension often overlooked. The relationship between kings and bishops was not purely strategic. It carried human stakes. Clerics were aware that the dynasty they endorsed represented the survival of memory, myth, and identity. Kings recognized that without ecclesiastical validation, their sacred blood might not suffice to maintain loyalty or obedience. Every decision carried consequences for family, followers, and subjects. Every alliance, betrayal, or public ritual shaped both political and spiritual realities. This intertwining of faith and politics also created opportunities for moral narrative. Chroniclers could frame the Merovingians' actions in terms of divine will, sin, or virtue, reinforcing the Church's authority while simultaneously recording the dynasty's presence. Yet they could also manipulate perception, emphasizing failures or moral weakness when convenient. This narrative control underscores the subtle but profound influence the Church wielded in shaping history, even while it remained bound to the dynasty it sought to manage. The sacred alliance extended beyond political maneuvering into the realm of ritual. Kings were baptized, anointed, and crowned with ceremonies that emphasized both divine approval and hereditary right. These rituals were not mere pageantry. They functioned as visible expressions of the pact, bridging the gap between ancestral legitimacy and ecclesiastical sanction. They reinforced the perception that the Merovingian line was unique, divinely chosen, and yet dependent on a network of human intermediaries who could validate or challenge their rule. Ultimately, the alliance between the Merovingians and the Church was one of both opportunity and tension. It offered kings like Clovis the ability to consolidate power, unify disparate peoples, and secure the moral authority that legitimized their reign. But it also required constant negotiation, compromise, and vigilance. The dynasty's sacred bloodline was a source of strength and a potential threat. The Church could protect or undermine it. And as history would show, the eventual erasure of the Merovingians from political prominence was as much a product of this complex relationship as any external invasion or rebellion. In the quiet moments of history, one can imagine the tension in these royal courts. Bishops advising kings on matters of faith and law. Queens negotiating marriage alliances to safeguard lineage. Kings aware of the weight of their bodies, their hair, and their mythic ancestry. Every gesture, every word, every ceremony carried significance beyond the immediate, weaving a delicate tapestry of power that blended blood, faith, and politics in ways that continue to fascinate centuries later. The Merovingian pact with the Church reminds us that authority is never simple. It is negotiated, performed, and continually reinforced. It relies on belief as much as on force, on ritual as much as on law. And when the delicate balance is disrupted, when kings weaken or institutions grow stronger, the consequences can be both immediate and enduring. Through this lens, we begin to understand the paradox of the Merovingians. Their sacred lineage, which should have guaranteed eternal authority, ultimately became a vulnerability. Their alliance with the Church, meant to secure legitimacy, also set the stage for their marginalization. And yet, despite their eventual erasure, the early Merovingians' understanding of power, as both inherited and sanctioned, mystical and practical, left an indelible mark on European history, shaping how kingdoms would be built, maintained, and remembered for centuries to come. In the shadowed corners of Merovingian history, the queens emerged not merely as consorts but as architects of power, guardians of lineage, and sometimes the most feared figures in the kingdom. Chroniclers of the time often portrayed them as cruel, scheming, or monstrous, especially women like Brunhilde and Fredegund, whose reputations are riddled with accusations of murder, manipulation, and relentless ambition. Yet to view these women solely through the lens of scandal is to misunderstand their significance. They were central to the preservation and projection of the Merovingian bloodline, wielding influence in a world where physical presence, ritual, and ancestral legitimacy defined authority. From the moment they married into the dynasty, these queens became more than wives. They became conduits of sacred continuity. Their bodies carried the future. Their children represented both the hope and the threat inherent in royal succession. In a time when kingship was often as much symbolic as practical, queens served as the invisible stabilizers of power, ensuring that the sacred lineage would endure despite the chaos that threatened from all sides. To protect the bloodline was to protect the dynasty itself. In many ways, these women were the living embodiment of Merovingian survival. Brunhilde, perhaps the most notorious of Merovingian queens, arrived in Gaul as a Visigothic princess. Her marriage to King Sigebert I was intended to forge a political alliance, a common practice among European nobility. Yet the young queen quickly became more than a diplomatic pawn. She navigated a dangerous political landscape with intelligence, courage, and sometimes ruthless pragmatism. She survived assassination attempts, rivalries with powerful families, and ongoing conflicts between her husband's supporters and enemies. Her role extended beyond domestic management. She advised, negotiated, and sometimes commanded, shaping the trajectory of the kingdom and the legacy of the dynasty itself. Fredegund, her rival and later a queen regent, presents a different but equally compelling narrative. Rising from a background of uncertainty, her ascent demonstrates how women in the Merovingian period could exploit circumstances with remarkable strategic skill. Fredegund's methods were often violent, her reputation stained by alleged poisonings, assassinations, and intrigues. Yet this reputation tells us as much about how history has been recorded as it does about her deeds. Chroniclers, many of them church-affiliated, had a vested interest in demonizing women who exercised real power, particularly when that power challenged ecclesiastical or patriarchal norms. The truth likely lies somewhere between legend and record. Fredegund wielded authority with a combination of intelligence, decisiveness, and, when necessary, ruthlessness. The significance of these queens extends beyond their immediate political maneuvers. They were instrumental in maintaining the continuity of the sacred bloodline. In a system where kingship was embodied in the body, where hair, ritual, and ancestry carried authority, the queen's role was to ensure that the next generation preserved these attributes. Their vigilance over succession, marriage alliances, and education of heirs was critical. A misstep could weaken the lineage, invite external threats, or provide rivals with justification for intervention. In this sense, queens were the custodians of dynastic memory, the silent keepers of what made Merovingian kings sacred and legitimate. This responsibility came with enormous personal risk. Political conflict in Merovingian Gaul was often violent and brutal. Queens were not immune. Brunhilde, after decades of influence, was ultimately captured and executed in a manner both public and symbolic, illustrating the dangers inherent in her position. Fredegund, while often feared, also had to navigate the constant threat of betrayal and rebellion. Their lives remind us that power, especially female power, was inseparable from danger. To protect a dynasty, a queen had to act decisively, and history often judges such decisiveness harshly. Yet, despite the chroniclers' attempts to vilify them, these queens shaped the Merovingian legacy in ways that extended far beyond immediate political survival. They preserved cultural memory, reinforced the importance of lineage, and demonstrated that women could exert influence in ways that were both subtle and profound. They controlled the narrative through patronage of religious institutions, strategic marriages, and active participation in governance. In doing so, they helped the dynasty survive the internal and external pressures that would later overwhelm weaker kings. Queens also played a role in maintaining the delicate balance between the Merovingian dynasty and the church. They acted as intermediaries, advocates, and sometimes negotiators in conflicts where both secular and spiritual authority intersected. Their influence ensured that the sacred bloodline remained recognized and respected, even when the king himself was weak or absent. This was a form of political mastery often invisible to the chroniclers, but essential for the stability of the realm. Furthermore, The queen's control over succession and heirs had profound implications for the dynasty's future. The Merovingians were not simply rulers. They were symbols, embodiments of sacred authority. The children they produced had to inherit not only territory and title but the legitimacy that came with blood, ritual, and lineage. Queens orchestrated marriages and alliances to strengthen claims, prevent rebellion, and secure the dynasty's future. Their vigilance over heirs ensured that the bloodline, rather than institutions or temporary alliances, remained the core of power. The historical portrayal of these women as monstrous or manipulative obscures the complexity of their contributions. Brunhilde and Fredegund were agents of continuity in a volatile world. Their actions, while sometimes violent or morally ambiguous, were aimed at survival, both of their families and the sacred line they represented. Chroniclers wrote of them with bias, influenced by political agendas, religious moralizing, and patriarchal assumptions. Yet even in negative portrayals, the narrative confirms their influence. History fears those who wield power effectively, especially when it challenges established norms. The emotional dimension of their role is equally significant. Queens carried not only political responsibility but the weight of dynastic survival. Every decision, whether to act decisively against a rival, protect a child, or negotiate with the church, was infused with stakes that could affect the future of the kingdom. Their influence shaped the lives of countless subjects and determined the course of European history. They were both revered and feared, embodying the duality of power, necessary for survival yet always dangerous to those who perceive themselves as rivals. In essence, Merovingian queens were both symbols and actors. They preserved the sacred bloodline, safeguarded the legitimacy of kings, and mediated between the mystical inheritance of the dynasty and the political realities of their time. They demonstrated that authority in early medieval Europe was not the sole province of men or warriors but was inseparable from lineage, ritual, and the careful management of both family and public perception. Their stories remind us that history is not merely the record of kings and battles, but a tapestry woven from the actions of those who work behind the throne, shaping destiny in ways that are often hidden yet enduring. Brunhilde, Fredegund, and their peers illustrate the human stakes of power, ambition, courage, loyalty, and the relentless pressure to protect a heritage that was as sacred as it was vulnerable. By understanding the role of these queens, we gain a deeper appreciation for the Merovingian dynasty itself, not merely as a line of kings, but as a living, breathing institution supported by women whose vigilance, intelligence, and determination preserved the sacred bloodline through some of the most turbulent centuries in European history. And in acknowledging their influence, we confront a quiet truth. The survival of a dynasty often depends less on swords than on the women who wielded unseen authority, shaping the past in ways that history has too often overlooked. The Merovingian kings who followed Clovis often appear in history under a label that seems at first both dismissive and puzzling: the Roysvanians, or do-nothing kings. To modern eyes, this may suggest incompetence, laziness, or moral failure. Yet such judgments obscure the subtlety of their situation and the complex dynamics that defined power during their reign. These kings were not inherently powerless. Rather, the very structure of Merovingian authority had shifted, leaving the kings as symbols of continuity while the practical levers of governance passed to others. Understanding this transformation is crucial to grasping how a dynasty rooted in sacred blood could be simultaneously revered, feared, and ultimately diminished. The early Merovingians had wielded authority in a world that required personal presence, visible leadership, and the embodiment of power. Clovis had commanded armies, mediated disputes, and enacted laws with a combination of ritual authority and political acumen. His successors, however, inherited a different reality. The kingdom had expanded, encompassing diverse territories and populations whose loyalty could not be secured by myth or charisma alone. The administrative demands of governance increased exponentially. Kings were expected to maintain armies, adjudicate disputes, manage taxation, and coordinate with bishops and local officials, all while maintaining the symbolic aura of sacred lineage that distinguished them from ordinary men. Into this evolving landscape stepped the mayors of the palace, the aristocratic officials who increasingly handled the practical affairs of the kingdom. Initially, they were administrators, advisors, and stewards, meant to assist the king. Over time, however, they accumulated influence, wealth, and military power, gradually eclipsing the symbolic authority of the throne. By the late Merovingian period, it was often these officials, rather than the kings themselves, who determined the outcome of wars, negotiated treaties, and exercised day-to-day governance. The king remained a figurehead, a living symbol of continuity, but one whose practical relevance was steadily eroded. This shift did not occur by accident. It was facilitated both by the changing political environment and by the very nature of the Merovingian kingship. Kings who ruled through sacred inheritance and ceremonial authority were inherently limited in their ability to respond to the administrative and military demands of an increasingly complex realm. Their legitimacy depended on their bloodline, their heir, their symbolic presence, not necessarily their capacity to manage logistics or enforce law across vast territories. As the kingdom grew and the demands of governance multiplied, those who excelled at management, the mayors of the palace, naturally gained prominence. Yet this apparent decline in royal power should not be confused with weakness in a moral or symbolic sense. The kings remained potent figures, capable of invoking loyalty, awe, and fear simply by their presence. Their sacred status, rooted in blood and myth, remained intact. They could still command respect and influence, particularly in matters of ceremonial importance or religious significance. What changed was the locus of practical authority. Power was no longer inseparable from the king's person. It had begun to reside in the network of officials and administrators who executed the kingdom's functions. The do-nothing label is therefore a mischaracterization, reflecting the perspective of later chroniclers who were writing after the rise of the Carolingians. To these writers, the Merovingians' reliance on ritualized authority and sacred bloodline seemed lazy or ineffective. They judged kings not by the symbolic and religious weight they carried, but by the pragmatic standards of institutional governance that would dominate later medieval monarchy. This retrospective interpretation obscures the nuanced reality. The Merovingians' approach to kingship was effective in its own context, even as it became increasingly incompatible with emerging political structures. This transition also highlights the tension between sacred legitimacy and administrative necessity. The Merovingians' authority was fundamentally embodied. It existed in their bodies, their lineage, and the myths that surrounded them. Administrative competence, while valuable, could not substitute for the visible markers of divine or ancestral right. As the kingdom evolved, this embodiment of power became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it ensured reverence and continuity. On the other, it limited adaptability, leaving the kings dependent on capable subordinates to manage the practical realities of governance. It is also essential to consider the human element. The Merovingian kings lived under constant pressure from both internal and external forces. Rival nobles, ambitious mayors, and neighboring kingdoms all posed threats to their authority. The delicate balance between ceremonial prominence and practical governance required careful negotiation, diplomacy, and, at times, restraint. A king who intervened too forcefully risked provoking rebellion. One who failed to act sufficiently risked losing prestige. In this environment, maintaining symbolic authority while delegating practical power was not necessarily laziness. It was a strategy for survival. The perception of inactivity, however, allowed later rulers to exploit the narrative. When the Carolingians rose to prominence, they framed the Merovingians as ineffectual, reinforcing the idea that a dynasty reliant on sacred inheritance was inherently weak. This narrative served multiple purposes. It legitimized the transfer of power, justified the erasure of the Merovingians from political relevance, and reinforced the emerging model of kingship based on institutional authority and administrative competence rather than mystical lineage. Even in their apparent decline, the Merovingians retained an aura of sacredness that made them distinct from their successors. Their very presence reminded contemporaries that authority could exist independently of bureaucratic function. Their long hair, their ritual practices, and their mythic lineage continued to signal power that could not be fully quantified or controlled. In a sense, the do-nothing kings were doing exactly what their system required, embodying the sacred continuity of the dynasty while others handled the mechanics of rule. This period also exposes the fragility of symbolic power in the face of structural change. As administrative complexity increased and military threats became more organized, the limitations of kingship based purely on heritage became more apparent. Authority that cannot adapt is vulnerable to being overshadowed, co-opted, or erased. The Merovingian symbolic power, once unassailable, became a liability in a world increasingly governed by institutional hierarchies. Ultimately, the Royce-Fanians are best understood not as failures but as casualties of a system in transition. Their apparent inactivity masks the profound shift in the nature of kingship, from sacred embodiment to bureaucratic management. It also underscores the fragility of dynastic authority in a landscape where power could be negotiated, delegated, or seized by those adept at navigating both tradition and pragmatism. The story of these kings invites reflection on the nature of power itself. Authority is not a static quality. It exists in relation to institutions, rituals, perception, and myth. A ruler may appear inactive while still serving a critical function in maintaining continuity and legitimacy. The Merovingians' reliance on sacred blood and ceremonial authority, even as their practical control waned, demonstrates that power can exist in forms that resist simple measurement. By examining the do-nothing kings, we gain insight into the subtle mechanics of medieval rule, how dynasties could survive in appearances while delegating responsibility, how sacred lineage could coexist with administrative reliance, and how history itself could be rewritten to favor new narratives. The Merovingians were not simply passive relics. They were living symbols of a system of kingship that prized embodied authority, continuity, and myth as much as martial prowess or bureaucratic skill. And in recognizing this, we begin to understand the delicate tragedy of the dynasty. Kings who were powerful because they were sacred, yet vulnerable because the world around them was changing. A lineage once absolute in authority could be rendered passive by circumstance, misinterpreted by chroniclers, and eventually eclipsed by a new order, even while the aura of their ancient power lingered in memory, myth, and legend. As the Merovingian kings gradually receded into ceremonial roles, a new class of power brokers emerged from the shadows, the mayors of the palace. Initially intended as stewards, administrators, and advisors to the king, these officials gradually consolidated authority in ways that would reshape the very structure of Frankish governance. They were men who understood that power did not always need to be visible to be effective. While the kings maintained the sacred aura of legitimacy, the mayors wielded the practical levers of politics, law, and military command, quietly steering the kingdom according to their own ambitions. The office of mayor of the palace originated in the Merovingian court as a managerial role, designed to oversee royal estates, coordinate resources, and manage household affairs. It was a position of trust, essential for maintaining the functioning of a kingdom whose rulers were often preoccupied with ceremonial duties or regional oversight. Over time, however, certain mayors recognized an opportunity inherent in their proximity to kings whose authority was increasingly symbolic. By controlling access, influencing decisions, and managing military campaigns, they could accumulate wealth, influence, and political capital, transforming a once administrative position into a quasi-sovereign power. Among the most notable early mayors was Pepin of Herstal, a man whose skill in administration, strategy, and negotiation allowed him to dominate the Merovingian court without ever claiming the throne outright. Pepin understood that authority was as much about perception as action. By acting in the king's name, he could command armies, enforce laws, and secure loyalty from nobles, all while avoiding the political risks of overt kingship. This approach allowed him to build a power base that was nearly independent of the monarch, and yet carefully framed as service rather than usurpation. The rise of the mayors illustrates a fundamental tension in Merovingian governance, the separation of sacred and practical authority. The kings were still seen as divinely ordained, the carriers of sacred blood, and the symbolic unity of the realm. Their long hair, ceremonial roles, and mythic lineage signaled continuity and legitimacy. The mayors, on the other hand, acted in the mundane realm of politics, collecting taxes, managing armies, adjudicating disputes, and ensuring that the kingdom functioned on a day-to-day basis. This division of labor was unprecedented, creating a dual system of authority in which power existed both as visible legitimacy and as practical control. The mayor's increasing influence was not universally accepted. Tensions inevitably arose between king and steward, between symbolic ruler and functional administrator. Some Merovingian kings attempted to reassert authority, but by this stage the structural advantage rested with the mayors. They controlled resources, commanded loyalty, and often had the support of the nobility. Moreover, the church frequently sided with capable administrators, recognizing that stability, protection of ecclesiastical lands, and enforcement of moral and social order depended on effective governance more than ceremonial symbolism. This shift was gradual but profound. By the late 7th century, the mayors of the palace effectively governed the Frankish realm while kings remained largely figureheads. Pepin of Herstal and his successors exercised control over military campaigns, alliances, and succession, often determining who would ascend the throne. Their influence extended across multiple kingdoms, transcending the boundaries of a single ruler's authority. In essence, they became the de facto rulers of the Merovingian Empire, holding power without ever officially taking the crown. The dynamics between king and mayor reveal much about the nature of political power in early medieval Europe. Authority could be maintained symbolically while practical control rested elsewhere. Sacred lineage ensured respect, continuity, and legitimacy, while competence, ambition, and resource control dictated real-world outcomes. This duality made the Merovingian system both resilient and vulnerable. Resilient because it separated the mystical from the mundane, allowing sacred authority to survive despite administrative weakness, yet vulnerable because the same structure allowed ambitious mayors to gradually dominate, redirect, or even eclipse the monarchy itself. The consequences of this arrangement became particularly evident during periods of succession. When a king died or proved ineffective, mayors were in a position to influence the selection of his heir, or to consolidate power themselves. They could manipulate marriage alliances, coordinate military loyalty, and shape the political landscape without ever needing to claim sacred legitimacy. This combination of discretion, resource control, and strategic vision allowed the office of mayor to evolve from a managerial role into a powerful institution capable of directing the fate of the kingdom. The rise of the mayors also had implications for the Merovingian dynasty's relationship with the church. While the king's sacred lineage ensured symbolic legitimacy, the church increasingly relied on capable administrators to enforce moral and social authority. Mayors like Pepin coordinated the protection of church property, ensured the enforcement of laws influenced by religious norms, and facilitated communication between ecclesiastical and secular spheres. In doing so, they became indispensable intermediaries, their influence growing even as the kings themselves receded into ceremonial roles. At the same time, this concentration of power outside the throne created a fragile equilibrium. The kings, though increasingly ceremonial, were still necessary symbols. They legitimized decisions, rituals, and military actions. A mayor who overstepped risked appearing as a usurper, inviting rebellion or ecclesiastical opposition. Successful mayors learned to act as shadows behind the throne, shaping events while leaving the outward appearance of continuity intact. This delicate balance required political cunning, patience, and a deep understanding of both human psychology and the symbolic power of the monarchy. The transformation of the mayors of the palace foreshadows a critical shift in European governance. The eventual replacement of dynasties by institutions that prioritize competence, strategy, and resource control over hereditary or mystical authority. The Merovingians, whose power rested in the sacred and symbolic, provided the stage upon which this transition occurred. Their reliance on ceremonial legitimacy, once a strength, became a structural vulnerability, allowing capable administrators to consolidate authority without overtly challenging the king's place in ritual and mythology. Yet even as the mayors rose, the Merovingian kings remained potent symbols. They were reminders of a lineage older than the church, a bloodline intertwined with myth, ritual, and sacred power. While their day-to-day influence waned, their presence maintained the legitimacy that allowed the mayors to govern effectively. This symbiotic relationship, administrative competence and symbolic continuity, characterized the late Merovingian period and shaped the evolution of European monarchy for centuries. Ultimately, The rise of the mayors of the palace demonstrates the adaptability and vulnerability of political systems. Authority does not reside solely in titles or rituals. It exists wherever influence, resources, and perception converge. The Merovingians' sacred kingship provided stability and continuity, while the mayor's practical acumen ensured survival and governance. Together, they illustrate a fundamental principle of medieval politics. Power is both visible and invisible, embodied and enacted, ceremonial and practical. In understanding the mayors of the palace, we also glimpse the beginning of the Merovingian dynasty's slow eclipse. By consolidating practical authority, the mayors paved the way for their eventual heirs to claim the throne outright, marking the transition to the Carolingian era. Yet the memory of the Merovingians, their sacred bloodline, and the mystical authority they embodied persisted, influencing perceptions of kingship and legitimacy long after their political relevance had faded. The story of the mayors is therefore inseparable from the story of the Merovingians themselves. It is a tale of ambition and adaptation, of power shifting from the visible to the invisible, from ceremonial kings to strategic stewards. It is a story that reminds us that authority is never absolute, that legitimacy and control can exist in different forms, and that the decline of one dynasty often occurs quietly, in the corridors of influence, rather than on the battlefield. Through this lens, the Merovingians' apparent decline is revealed as a complex interplay of tradition, symbolism, and administrative evolution. The mayors of the palace were both successors and shadows, reshaping the kingdom while leaving the outward forms of sacred kingship intact. And in this delicate dance, we see the paradox of power in early medieval Europe, that influence can reside in the background, yet ultimately shape the destiny of kingdoms and dynasties in ways far more enduring than the visible authority of the throne itself. The final long-haired king, Childeric III, embodies the tragic culmination of the Merovingian dynasty's slow decline. By the time of his reign, the symbolic authority that had once defined kingship was increasingly overshadowed by the practical power of the mayors of the palace. Childeric III inherited a throne heavy with history, myth, and expectation, yet one stripped of the mechanisms necessary to enforce authority. His reign was brief, his power nominal, and his fate preordained, a living embodiment of the tension between sacred blood and political reality. Childeric III ascended the throne in 743, at a time when the Merovingians' influence was already waning. The once proud kings, whose long hair had signaled sanctity, legitimacy, and continuity, had become ceremonial figures. Their authority was a shadow, acknowledged in ritual and tradition, but insufficient to direct armies, manage estates, or adjudicate disputes effectively. The office of mayor of the palace, now firmly established, had become the center of real power. Figures like Charles Martel wielded armies, controlled loyalty among nobles, and dictated succession, all while maintaining the outward appearance of service to the king. Childeric III was caught between these worlds, a king in name but not in substance. From the outset, Childeric's position was precarious. His coronation was traditional, involving ritual, ceremony, and the recognition of his sacred lineage. Yet the ceremony itself was a reminder of the limitations imposed upon him. Long hair still marked his status as king, signaling continuity and ancestral legitimacy, but it could not compensate for the absence of real political authority. The visual and symbolic power that had once enforced loyalty no longer sufficed to command obedience from nobles or mayors who had mastered the levers of governance. The tension between symbolic and practical power reached its climax in Childeric's deposition in 751. Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel and a man who had already accumulated significant authority as mayor of the palace, sought to formalize what had long been the de facto arrangement. The throne would be transferred, not to a usurper in the conventional sense, but to someone whose control of resources, armies, and loyalty was undeniable. Childeric's removal was therefore both inevitable and meticulously calculated, a politically surgical act that demonstrated the culmination of the Merovingian decline. The deposition was carried out with ritual precision, reflecting both the desire to preserve appearances and the symbolic importance of the Merovingians. Childeric's hair was cut, an act that had always been the ultimate statement of disenfranchisement. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to sever the tangible connection between body, bloodline, and authority. It was not murder, but it was an annihilation of identity. Stripped of his long hair, Childeric ceased to be a king in the sacred sense, even as he continued to live. The symbolic act ensured that while the dynasty might survive biologically, it could no longer exercise authority. After his tonsure, Childeric was sent to a monastery, a fate consistent with Merovingian tradition for deposed rulers. The monastery offered the appearance of mercy and protection but functioned as a prison, removing him entirely from political life. In a society that understood kingship as embodied authority, this was effectively a form of living death. Childeric remained alive, but powerless, reduced to a silent witness of the dynasty's end. This moment exemplifies the paradox of Merovingian kingship. Power was inseparable from symbolism, yet symbolism alone could not defend against the forces of structural change. Childeric III's deposition illustrates the vulnerabilities inherent in a system where legitimacy is inherited rather than exercised. Sacred blood could command awe, loyalty, and reverence, but it could not replace administrative competence or military control. The very rituals that had once reinforced kingship, the hair, the coronation, the sacred lineage, were powerless against the calculated authority of the mayor of the palace. Childeric's fate also reflects the broader historical strategy of neutralizing potentially dangerous figures without resorting to outright violence. The Church, which had facilitated the transfer of authority to Pepin, favored a solution that preserved the sanctity of ritual while ensuring political stability. Executing Childeric might have provoked unrest or rebellion. Imprisoning him in a monastery after cutting his hair achieved the same strategic result while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy and piety. It was a methodical, precise, and chillingly effective form of power. The story of Childeric III underscores the fragility of dynasties reliant on symbolic authority in a changing political environment. While the Merovingians had maintained control for centuries through ritual, lineage, and myth, the demands of governance, military organization, economic management, and negotiation with a powerful nobility had shifted the center of gravity away from the throne. Childeric's reign was a final testament to this shift. A king in appearance, but not in substance, ultimately displaced by those who understood how to wield authority in both visible and practical ways. Even in deposition, however, the Merovingian legacy was preserved symbolically. The careful handling of Childeric ensured that the dynasty's mythic significance, its sacred lineage, and its role as a cultural touchstone persisted, even as its political power vanished. Chroniclers would continue to reference the Merovingians, framing them alternately as figures of reverence, cautionary examples, or failures, depending on the ideological needs of the writer. The symbolic power of the dynasty endured, long after its capacity to govern had faded. Childeric III's deposition marked more than the end of a reign. It signaled the transition of European kingship from hereditary, sacred authority to one increasingly intertwined with institutional, administrative, and military structures. The Carolingians, who replaced the Merovingians, leveraged both the symbolic continuity of the old dynasty and the practical authority they had already accumulated to consolidate power. They recognized the importance of ritual and lineage while asserting dominance over governance, blending tradition with innovation in ways that the Merovingians had been unable to achieve in their final years. The human tragedy of Childeric's fate should not be overlooked. He was a living symbol of a dying system, stripped of identity, confined, and erased from practical power. His life in the monastery, removed from political and familial influence, serves as a poignant reminder that dynasties are as vulnerable to structural change as they are to conquest. The last Merovingian king's existence was a testament to the enduring tension between sacred heritage and the realities of governance, between symbolism and substance. In this sense, Childeric III's story is emblematic of the broader arc of Merovingian history. The dynasty had risen from chaos, built legitimacy through myth, ritual, and sacred blood, and sustained authority through both charisma and lineage. Yet the very qualities that made it powerful mystical heritage, ceremonial dominance, and symbolic authority became insufficient as the structures of governance evolved. Childeric's deposition was the inevitable consequence of this historical trajectory. The ceremonial king, powerless in the face of practical authority, removed with precision and ritual, leaving behind a dynasty remembered more in myth than in governance. The fall of Childeric III is therefore both an end and a lesson. It illustrates how dynasties rooted in sacred legitimacy can be neutralized without violence, how symbolic authority can be rendered inert, and how structural shifts in governance can eclipse even the most ancient and revered bloodlines. His story is a silent witness to the Merovingians' transformation from rulers of Europe to figures of legend, preserved in chronicles, memory, and ritual even as the throne they once commanded passed irrevocably to others. In the final analysis, Childeric III stands as the embodiment of the Merovingian paradox. A king alive but powerless, sacred yet subordinate, a dynasty erased from political relevance yet immortalized in history. His hair, cut and laid aside, symbolized the severing of a lineage's authority, while his continued life reflected the careful preservation of ceremonial continuity. Through him, we witness the last chapter of a dynasty that shaped Europe not only through conquest and law but through myth, ritual, and the enduring power of sacred blood. The transition from Merovingian to Carolingian rule was not merely a change of kings. It was a calculated rewriting of authority, legitimacy, and historical memory. Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel and one of the most adept mayors of the palace, understood that power was not solely a matter of heredity or ritual. Authority required recognition, both from the nobility who controlled loyalty and resources, and from the church whose blessing conferred moral and spiritual legitimacy. The Carolingian coup, formalized in 751, was the culmination of decades of subtle power consolidation, a political revolution framed as continuity. The Merovingians had become ceremonial monarchs, their sacred lineage preserved, but their practical influence eroded. Kings like Childeric III existed as symbols, embodiments of a bloodline whose mystical authority once demanded obedience but now could no longer enforce it. Pepin and his predecessors had recognized the opportunity. By leveraging administrative competence, military command, and alliances with the church, they could consolidate real power while preserving the appearance of continuity. Their strategy was precise. Remove the symbolic king, maintain the ritual of legitimacy, and replace authority with figures whose power was both tangible and unquestionable. The process began with careful negotiation with ecclesiastical authorities. The church had long played a dual role in Merovingian politics, endorsing kings, mediating disputes, and protecting moral order, while simultaneously recognizing the limits of dynasties whose authority derived from sacred ancestry rather than administrative skill. Pepin understood that deposing Childeric III without church approval would risk rebellion and delegitimize the coup. He sought the Pope's blessing, framing the transfer of power as both necessary and divinely sanctioned. By presenting the deposition as a moral and political imperative, he ensured that the act would be seen not as usurpation, but as the natural evolution of governance. The Pope's approval was not merely symbolic. It was a powerful instrument of legitimization. By sanctioning Pepin's ascent, the Church aligned spiritual authority with political reality, creating a model of kingship in which divine blessing reinforced practical control. Pepin's coronation was therefore a careful blend of innovation and continuity. It preserved ritual, honored sacred precedent, and simultaneously replaced a ceremonial king with an effective ruler. This moment exemplified a profound shift in European monarchy. Authority was now explicitly conferred through both ecclesiastical recognition and the practical exercise of power. The deposition of Childeric III itself was methodical and symbolic. His hair, the visible marker of Merovingian legitimacy, was cut, signifying the severing of ancestral authority. He was sent to a monastery, removed from the political sphere yet preserved in life to maintain ceremonial propriety. By neutralizing the symbolic king without violence, the coup avoided the dangers of bloodshed while ensuring that the Carolingians would not face the moral or social repercussions of regicide. The ritual precision of this act highlights the sophistication of Pepin's strategy. The dynasty was displaced, not annihilated, and the transfer of power appeared both lawful and divinely justified. Pepin's ascension also illustrates the complex interplay between hereditary authority and practical governance. The Carolingians inherited legitimacy not only through martial success and administrative competence, but also through a careful appropriation of the Merovingian symbolic framework. By presenting themselves as the rightful heirs to the throne, endorsed by the Church, they integrated the sacred aura of the previous dynasty into a new political reality. The message was subtle yet powerful. While the old kings were no longer capable of exercising authority, their lineage and the rituals surrounding it could be harnessed to strengthen a new order. This transition was not universally accepted, and it required careful management of the nobility. Frankish aristocrats, accustomed to the symbolic authority of the Merovingians and the practical power of the mayors, had to be convinced that Pepin's kingship served both continuity and stability. Through a combination of military loyalty, strategic marriage alliances, and promises of protection, Pepin secured the support of key nobles, ensuring that the transition would be smooth and uncontested. The success of the coup demonstrates the importance of perception and consent in medieval politics. Authority is as much about belief and recognition as it is about force or lineage. The Carolingian coup also underscores the changing role of the Church in political affairs. By sanctioning Pepin's reign, the papacy asserted its authority not merely as spiritual overseer but as arbiter of political legitimacy. This partnership between ruler and church would become a defining feature of European monarchy, establishing a precedent in which divine approval and practical governance were intertwined. The Pope's involvement lent moral weight to the transfer of power and created a framework in which kingship could be simultaneously sacred and functional. From a broader perspective, the coup highlights the strategic use of narrative in shaping historical memory. The Merovingians were portrayed as ineffective and incapable, justifying their removal. The Carolingians framed themselves as restorers of order, aligning divine favor with administrative competence. Chroniclers reinforced this narrative, emphasizing the moral and practical necessity of the transition. History, in this sense, became a tool of legitimacy. Selective interpretation, carefully curated events, and ritualized acts were all employed to cement the authority of the new dynasty. Yet the displacement of the Merovingians was not simply a political maneuver. It was also an erasure of alternative forms of power. The Merovingians' authority had been embodied, mystical, and rooted in sacred bloodline, a legitimacy independent of administrative skill or military command. By replacing them with the Carolingians, who combined practical competence with sanctioned legitimacy, Europe shifted toward a model of kingship that prized tangible power aligned with ritual recognition. The symbolic authority of the Merovingians was neutralized, and the balance between myth and administration was irrevocably altered. The consequences of the coup extended far beyond Pepin's reign. It established the precedent that the papacy could confer legitimacy, that practical governance could supersede inherited sacred authority, and that dynastic continuity could be maintained even as the ruling family changed. This model would inform the succession practices, coronation rituals, and political philosophy of European monarchy for centuries, influencing how legitimacy, ritual, and governance were intertwined across the continent. In reflecting on the Carolingian takeover, it is clear that the success of the coup depended on both strategy and timing. The Merovingians had weakened over generations, their sacred authority insufficient to counter the practical realities of administration. The mayors of the palace had accumulated power, the nobility had adapted to new political structures, and the church had established itself as an indispensable arbiter of legitimacy. Pepin's ascent was not merely opportunistic. It was the natural consequence of a historical trajectory in which the forms of authority embodied by the Merovingians could no longer satisfy the needs of governance. At its core, the Carolingian coup illustrates the delicate balance between symbolism and power. The Merovingians' sacred lineage, their ritual, and their mythic authority had once sufficed to command obedience. By the mid-8th century, these qualities alone were insufficient. Authority had to be exercised, sanctioned, and recognized in ways that aligned with emerging institutional frameworks. Pepin's ability to navigate this transition, combining political acumen, ecclesiastical endorsement, and strategic manipulation of narrative, ensured that he would not only seize power but also secure its legitimacy in the eyes of contemporaries and historians alike. The coup is therefore both a political and symbolic masterstroke. It demonstrates the evolution of European kingship from mystical, bloodline-based authority to a model grounded in practical control, ritual sanction, and institutional recognition. The Merovingians, once unrivaled in their sacred legitimacy, were rendered ceremonial. Their lineage, while respected, could no longer confer effective power. Pepin's ascension illustrates the rise of a new paradigm, one in which authority is negotiated, reinforced, and legitimized through a combination of skill, ritual, and alliance. Ultimately, the Carolingian coup is a story of transformation, continuity, and erasure. The Merovingians' symbolic presence was preserved even as their power was dismantled. The sacred bloodline that had once ensured obedience was neutralized through ritual, narrative, and institutional authority. And in this careful orchestration, we see the emergence of a new European political order, one that would define kingship, legitimacy, and power for generations to come. After the deposition of Childeric III and the rise of the Carolingians, the Merovingian bloodline did not vanish entirely, but it retreated into obscurity, often within the austere confines of monasteries. These religious institutions, intended as sanctuaries of spiritual reflection, became involuntary tombs for deposed kings and lesser members of the dynasty. Monasteries offered the outward appearance of mercy, piety, and continuity, yet for those confined within, they represented a complete erasure from political life and public memory. The surviving Merovingians existed in a world that simultaneously preserved and neutralized them, maintaining the ritual of lineage while stripping it of practical authority. Monastic confinement was both symbolic and practical. By placing deposed kings and potential heirs in religious houses, the Carolingians and the Church achieved multiple objectives. Firstly, they ensured that these figures could not claim power or rally support among nobles or soldiers. Freed from the political sphere, Merovingians could no longer challenge the new order. Secondly, monasteries provided a socially acceptable solution, framing their removal as an act of protection and devotion rather than political elimination. This allowed the transition to appear morally legitimate and divinely sanctioned. Thirdly, the presence of Merovingians in religious life reinforced the continuity of sacred blood, even as the dynasty's practical authority was nullified. Their ritual existence maintained the ceremonial framework of kingship, preserving the lineage as a symbolic anchor while ensuring it posed no threat to the emerging Carolingian state. Life in a monastery was far from idyllic for these former rulers. The daily routines of prayer, manual labor, and communal discipline represented a profound shift from the privileges and responsibilities of kingship. For men accustomed to commanding armies, adjudicating disputes, and overseeing entire territories, the monastic environment imposed a complete reversal of power. Their long hair, once a visible emblem of authority, had been cut, severing the last physical link to their legitimacy. The rituals that had once reinforced their status, coronations, ceremonies, and public appearances, were replaced by silent observance and labor, emphasizing obedience and humility. In this environment, identity and purpose were redefined by religious devotion rather than political authority, effectively transforming living symbols of power into passive witnesses of their own erasure. The psychological impact of monastic confinement cannot be understated. The Merovingians had been kings by inheritance, embodiment, and myth, with authority rooted in both blood and ritual. To remove them from their political and symbolic roles while leaving them alive created a living paradox. They retained the dignity of birth but lacked the ability to exercise it. This form of neutralization was subtle yet devastating. The dynasty's essence, its mystical authority, its sacred continuity, was preserved in theory, but it was functionally incapacitated. The living kings were reduced to shadows of their former selves, remembered by ritual but forgotten in action. Monasteries also functioned as centers of record-keeping, ensuring that the memory of the Merovingians persisted even as their influence waned. Scribes documented their presence, noting births, deaths, and religious acts, maintaining genealogical continuity for both ecclesiastical and historical purposes. Yet these records were selective, often emphasizing piety, humility, and the obedience of the confined kings rather than their former authority. By controlling the narrative, the Church subtly reshaped the perception of the dynasty, presenting the Merovingians as relics of a bygone era whose political relevance had naturally declined. This careful curation illustrates how institutions can both preserve and manipulate memory, balancing reverence for lineage with the pragmatic needs of contemporary power. The retreat of Merovingians into monastic life also underscores the adaptability of sacred authority. Though they were removed from governance, their lineage continued to exert influence, albeit indirectly. Monks and nuns descended from these kings could serve as intermediaries between religious and secular communities, preserving family networks and maintaining social connections. The very presence of Merovingian blood within monastic walls reinforced the idea that sacred authority remained embedded in society, even if its exercise had shifted from throne to cloister. This quiet continuity ensured that the dynasty's symbolic power endured, shaping perceptions of legitimacy and heritage long after its political dominance had ended. Yet this continuity was fragile and dependent on interpretation. Successive chroniclers, particularly under Carolingian rule, framed the Merovingians as ineffectual or morally compromised. Their retreat into monasteries was portrayed as a natural consequence of weakness, reinforcing the narrative that practical governance required both capability and divine sanction as interpreted by the Church. In reality, the confinement of Merovingians was a deliberate strategy to neutralize a potential threat while preserving the veneer of ritual legitimacy. By controlling both physical presence and historical memory, the new rulers ensured that the dynasty could survive symbolically without interfering with contemporary power structures. The monasteries themselves were not passive spaces in this process. They functioned as instruments of political strategy, moral instruction, and social control. The placement of former kings within these institutions reinforced hierarchies, showcased the Church's role as arbiter of legitimacy, and provided a controlled environment where sacred lineage could be acknowledged without threatening secular authority. In this way, monasteries became crucial nodes in a network of governance, mediating between past and present, sacred and practical power, and the living and symbolic dimensions of kingship. From a broader perspective, the fate of the Merovingians in monastic confinement illustrates a fundamental principle of medieval politics. Authority is not simply a matter of birth or ritual. It is enacted and sustained through recognition, control of resources, and practical ability. Sacred blood and ceremonial roles confer prestige, but without the capacity to exercise influence, they can be neutralized. The Merovingians' retreat into religious life demonstrates how dynasties can survive symbolically while losing functional relevance, a process that balances respect for tradition with the imperatives of political stability. The emotional and psychological resonance of this period is profound. For the Merovingians themselves, monasteries represented a form of exile, stripping them of purpose while maintaining outward respect. For the nobility and church, it was a practical solution to a complex problem: how to manage the remains of a dynasty whose sacred lineage could no longer command obedience, but whose symbolic significance could not be ignored. For historians and modern observers, it serves as a reminder that the line between life and erasure, authority and impotence, is often negotiated in quiet spaces rather than on the battlefield. Ultimately, the monasteries functioned as both sanctuaries and tombs. They preserved the Merovingian bloodline in ritual, genealogy, and memory, while ensuring that it could not disrupt the emerging Carolingian order. In doing so, they highlight the interplay between power, symbolism, and survival. The Merovingians were neither entirely vanquished nor fully alive in their political sense. They existed in a liminal space, simultaneously remembered and neutralized, ceremonial yet powerless. Through this lens, we understand the delicate strategy employed by the Carolingians and the Church: preserve the sacred authority of the past while consolidating the practical power of the present. The monasteries, in their dual role, became silent witnesses to a dynasty's transformation, ensuring continuity in theory, even as its capacity for action had been irrevocably removed. The story of the Merovingians' retreat into monastic life thus illuminates the subtleties of medieval power, the endurance of ritual authority, and the quiet, strategic methods by which history can be rewritten without bloodshed. As the Merovingians retreated into monasteries and ceremonial obscurity, the recording of their history became a complex and often contradictory endeavor. Chronicles, genealogies, and annals from the early medieval period are filled with gaps, inconsistencies, and deliberate omissions. This deliberate shaping of narrative was not unique to the Merovingians, but the peculiarities of their record reveal the broader tension between memory, power, and legitimacy in early Europe. The dynasty story is a study in selective preservation. What is written, what is erased, and what is left ambiguous often tells us more about the society documenting it than about the dynasty itself. From the outset, the Merovingians' records were fragmentary. Early chroniclers such as Gregory of Tours documented the rise and reigns of the kings, but their accounts were influenced by politics, personal bias, and the needs of their audiences. Kings who were strong, effective, or threatening to the church were emphasized, while those whose influence had waned were minimized or described in dismissive terms. This practice created a distorted historical memory. Later readers could conclude that Merovingian kings were incompetent or unworthy, even when their symbolic authority had been profound and culturally significant. The gaps and silences in the records were themselves meaningful. In several instances, entire reigns are poorly documented, with few contemporary sources surviving. This absence was not accidental. It reflects both the practical difficulties of record-keeping in a fragmented society and the intentional marginalization of rulers whose authority was inconvenient to more dominant powers, such as the church or the mayors of the palace. By selectively recording events, chroniclers were able to shape the perception of a dynasty, emphasizing weakness where independence had once existed and reinforcing narratives that justified the rise of the Carolingians. Genealogical manipulation played a central role in this process. Medieval genealogies were more than lists of names. They were instruments of legitimacy. Dynasties constructed, modified, or obscured lines of descent to assert authority, connect themselves to revered ancestors, or discredit rivals. The Merovingians' ancestry, with its mythic elements such as the Quinator legend, was selectively interpreted to emphasize divine or mystical sanction. Later writers, particularly under Carolingian rule, downplayed these elements, portraying the dynasty as flawed, weak, or morally compromised. In doing so, the memory of sacred blood was transformed into a narrative of decline, making the Carolingian transfer of power appear both natural and necessary. Forgeries and pseudo-documents also contributed to the shaping of Merovingian history. Monastic scribes, often working under the influence of powerful political actors, produced charters, hagiographies, and legal texts that enhanced or diminished claims of legitimacy. These documents, while historically unreliable in strict terms, reveal the strategies by which institutions controlled narrative. For example, the creation of texts attributing moral failings or do-nothing behavior to certain Merovingian kings served to delegitimize the dynasty in retrospect, justifying the transfer of power to more capable or institutionally aligned rulers. The survival of these documents, and the emphasis placed on them by later historians, underscores how the construction of history itself becomes a tool of authority. The selective preservation of memory also reflects broader cultural and institutional dynamics. The Church, as both a custodian of literacy and arbiter of legitimacy, had significant influence over which aspects of Merovingian history were recorded or emphasized. Chroniclers wrote for audiences that included monks, nobles, and ecclesiastical officials, and their narratives were designed to support prevailing power structures. Kings whose authority aligned with church interests were often portrayed favorably. Those whose lineage or actions challenged ecclesiastical control were marginalized or vilified. In this sense, the surviving records are as much about the priorities of the church and ruling institutions as they are about the Merovingians themselves. This manipulation of memory had practical implications. By reshaping the narrative of the Merovingians, the Carolingians were able to consolidate their own authority, presenting themselves as restorers of order and moral governance. The do-nothing king's label, applied retrospectively, legitimized the displacement of Childeric III and justified the new dynastic order. Readers of later chronicles were led to perceive the Merovingians as a failed line whose decline was inevitable, obscuring the complex social, political, and symbolic factors that had allowed them to maintain authority for centuries. The discrepancies in historical accounts also highlight the interaction between myth and memory. The Merovingians' sacred ancestry, long hair, and rituals imbued them with a level of authority that could not easily be quantified or described in administrative terms. Chroniclers, particularly under Carolingian influence, often struggled to reconcile these mystical elements with the practical realities of governance. The result was a selective historical record in which extraordinary claims about ancestry and sacred authority were minimized, ignored, or reframed as superstition. In this way, the history of the Merovingians reflects the broader challenge of integrating symbolic power into a narrative dominated by institutional authority. Even as the dynasty's political relevance waned, the persistence of certain myths and symbols illustrates the difficulty of complete erasure. References to sacred lineage, ritual kingship, and Merovingian ancestry appear repeatedly in chronicles, hagiographies, and legal texts, suggesting that memory, even when suppressed, cannot be entirely controlled. The tension between erasure and remembrance creates a layered historical narrative, one in which the dynasty is both diminished in authority and immortalized in ritual and legend. Moreover, the manipulation of Merovingian history demonstrates the role of historical narrative as a form of power. By controlling which events, rulers, and myths were emphasized, medieval institutions shaped contemporary perception and future memory. History became a tool to legitimize authority, justify dynastic change, and influence the understanding of kingship itself. In this sense, the gaps, forgeries, and selective chronicling of Merovingian history are not merely errors or accidents. They are deliberate exercises in political and cultural strategy. The Merovingians' partially obscured record also invites modern reflection on the nature of historical truth. What survives in chronicles and documents is filtered through layers of institutional priorities, narrative bias, and selective memory. Understanding the dynasty requires reading between these layers, recognizing the interplay between myth, politics, and ritual. The gaps in the record, the silences in the chronicles, and the contradictions between sources are themselves evidence of a dynasty whose authority was both real and contested, whose legacy was preserved and manipulated simultaneously. Ultimately, the story of Merovingian chronicles, forgeries, and omissions illustrates that history is never neutral. It is curated, interpreted, and often weaponized. The dynasty's decline was not merely political. It was narrative. By controlling the record, those in power shaped how generations would understand the Merovingians' rise, reign, and fall. The very act of writing or withholding history became a tool to manage memory, influence perception, and secure legitimacy. The Merovingian example serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of historical memory and the power of narrative. It reminds us that authority is not solely exercised in the present but also preserved, contested, and manipulated across time. Through selective recording, omission, and reinterpretation, the Merovingian story was transformed, their sacred lineage preserved in ritual while their practical authority was erased. The chronicles, forgeries, and silences surrounding their reign are more than historical curiosities. They are evidence of the deliberate and subtle ways in which history itself becomes a mechanism of power. Even as the political power of the Merovingian kings waned, traces of their authority persisted in subtle and often overlooked ways. One of the most fascinating aspects of this lingering influence lies not in chronicles or legal codes, but in symbols, seals, and architectural motifs, elements that silently communicated authority, continuity, and sacred lineage across centuries. These remnants form what could be called a sacred geometry of power, a visual and material language through which the dynasty's legacy endured, even after their practical rule had been neutralized. Symbols were integral to Merovingian authority from the earliest days of the dynasty. Their long hair, the rituals surrounding coronation, and the supposed divine or mystical ancestry conveyed messages about legitimacy, power, and continuity. Yet beyond these overt displays, the Merovingians also embedded meaning into objects, artwork, and architecture. Seals, coins, and decorative motifs were not merely ornamental. They were instruments of communication, conveying the sacred and temporal authority of the king in ways that could be recognized and interpreted by nobles, clergy, and common people alike. Coins, for instance, offer remarkable insight into the dynasty's symbolic strategy. Merovingian coinage often featured abstracted representations of the king, paired with Christian symbols such as crosses. These images simultaneously reinforced the dynasty's sacred legitimacy and its alignment with the church. The coins functioned as portable statements of authority, circulating throughout the kingdom, reaching regions far removed from the court. In this way, even kings whose practical power was limited maintained a visible presence in the daily lives of their subjects, a subtle reminder that the sacred lineage persisted. Architectural elements also carried symbolic significance. Churches, chapels, and royal residences constructed during the Merovingian period incorporated motifs that communicated both divine favor and dynastic legitimacy. Geometric patterns, symbolic carvings, and the orientation of structures all reflected an understanding that space could convey meaning. Buildings were not simply functional. They were instruments of propaganda, reinforcing the idea that the king's authority was divinely sanctioned and embedded in the very fabric of the world. The Merovingians understood that power was as much perceptual and spatial as it was political, and they used architecture to project influence even in areas where their practical control was waning. Seals and insignia provided another layer of symbolic continuity. These small but powerful artifacts were used to authenticate documents, assert ownership, and convey authority across distances. A seal bore the imprint of the king, often accompanied by symbols of divine favor or ancestral legitimacy. In an age when literacy was limited, these seals functioned as visual shorthand for authority, conveying messages that could be immediately recognized by anyone familiar with the symbolic language. Even after the dynasty's political relevance declined, these seals continued to circulate, preserving a tangible connection to Merovingian legitimacy and reinforcing the perception of continuity. Interestingly, the symbolic language of the Merovingians was remarkably adaptable. While rooted in sacred ancestry and ritualized kingship, it could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on context. Christian clergy might view a cross on a coin as evidence of pious alignment. Nobles might interpret the king's abstracted image as a reminder of legitimate rule. Common people might simply recognize it as a marker of continuity and stability. This flexibility allowed Merovingian symbols to endure, even when the practical power of the kings diminished. Symbols became a bridge between memory and authority, enabling a dynasty whose political influence had eroded to maintain a presence in the consciousness of the kingdom. The persistence of these symbols also reveals how the Merovingians' sacred legitimacy could survive erasure. While the Carolingians replaced them on the throne, they could not entirely suppress the symbolic and ritual traces of the previous dynasty. Coins, seals, and architectural motifs remained visible, acting as reminders that the sacred lineage had existed and could never be entirely extinguished. In effect, these symbols functioned as a form of cultural resilience, preserving the memory of a dynasty even as its political relevance faded. Moreover, the use of symbols highlights the interplay between tangible and intangible power. Sacred blood, long hair, and ritualized authority were invisible yet potent. Coins, seals, and architecture translated these qualities into physical form. By embedding legitimacy into objects and spaces, the Merovingians ensured that their authority could be experienced across time and distance, subtly influencing perceptions even after the dynasty ceased to govern actively. This demonstrates an early understanding of the importance of perception and representation in sustaining power, an understanding that would resonate throughout European history. Artistic motifs also carried a mnemonic function. Geometric patterns, stylized animals, and interlacing designs encoded meanings that were recognizable to those familiar with Merovingian culture. These motifs were not mere decoration. They served as visual reminders of lineage, sacredness, and authority. Even in the absence of kings who could govern directly, such imagery reinforced the dynasty's presence, creating a web of symbolic influence that reached across regions and generations. In this way, memory and authority were intertwined, each reinforcing the other through visual, tactile, and performative means. The endurance of Merovingian symbols also illustrates the subtle tension between erasure and remembrance. While chroniclers and political actors sought to minimize the dynasty's political relevance, they could not entirely suppress the tangible artifacts of their rule. Coins continued to circulate, seals continued to authenticate documents, and buildings continued to shape the spatial experience of authority. These symbols functioned as a quiet form of resistance, preserving the perception of legitimacy even when the dynasty's practical power had been neutralized. The persistence of symbolic authority had broader implications for European governance. It demonstrated that power could exist independently of direct control, that legitimacy could be maintained through ritual, representation, and material culture. Later dynasties would adopt similar strategies, using imagery, coinage, and ceremonial space to reinforce authority, even in the absence of immediate physical presence. The Merovingians, in this sense, served as a model for the ways in which symbolic continuity could coexist with political transformation, bridging the gap between mythic legitimacy and pragmatic governance. Ultimately, the sacred geometry of Merovingian power reveals a sophisticated understanding of authority. Kings who were increasingly ceremonial relied on symbols, seals, and architecture to maintain influence and project legitimacy. These artifacts ensured that even in periods of practical weakness, the dynasty remained visible, acknowledged, and influential in subtle but enduring ways. While the Merovingians' political control was eclipsed, their symbolic presence persisted, shaping perceptions of kingship, legitimacy, and power for generations to come. Through coins, seals, motifs, and buildings, the Merovingians communicated a form of authority that transcended direct rule. They encoded sacredness, continuity, and legitimacy into objects and spaces that could outlive individual kings, outlast political upheavals, and survive the narrative manipulations of later chroniclers. This sacred geometry of power ensured that, even as their practical reign ended, the Merovingians' legacy endured, whispering across time through symbols that remained potent reminders of a lineage that had once commanded both reverence and fear. Even as the Merovingians' political power waned and their kings became ceremonial figures, the church remained a key arbiter of their memory and legacy. Bishops, abbots, and chroniclers shaped the narrative of the dynasty in ways that both preserved and constrained it. Saints were canonized, moral judgments were pronounced, and histories were written with deliberate attention to what should be remembered and what should be suppressed. In this process, the Merovingians were transformed into a paradox, celebrated as pious and foundational figures in some contexts, and vilified as weak or decadent in others. The Church's influence over their memory highlights how authority and morality intertwined in medieval Europe, revealing that spiritual power could shape not only the present, but the interpretation of the past. The Church's role in preserving the Merovingians was complex. On the one hand, bishops and clerics relied on the dynasty to provide protection, patronage, and legitimacy. The sacred ancestry of the kings made them suitable intermediaries between earthly and divine authority. By aligning themselves with a dynasty perceived as divinely sanctioned, the Church could reinforce its own position, lending weight to moral edicts and social norms. Yet, this alignment came with careful negotiation. The same sacred authority that made the Merovingians useful could also threaten ecclesiastical control if the kings attempted to assert independent power. The Church had to balance reverence for lineage with practical oversight, ensuring that symbolic legitimacy did not translate into political challenge. Merovingian saints, particularly those from within the royal family, offer a window into this balancing act. Figures such as Saint Clotilde and other pious members of the dynasty were elevated as exemplars of Christian virtue. Hagiographies emphasize their devotion, charitable acts, and moral guidance, framing their sanctity in a way that reinforced the dynasty's religious legitimacy while subtly diminishing their political autonomy. By portraying these individuals primarily as holy figures rather than rulers, chroniclers preserved their sacred aura while neutralizing the practical threat of independent authority. The canonization process itself became a tool to manage memory. It acknowledged the dynasty's spiritual significance while simultaneously recasting their power in a form compatible with the Church's evolving priorities. At the same time, the Church played a critical role in framing the moral character of Merovingian kings. The chronicler's emphasis on the so-called do-nothing kings reflects a deliberate interpretive strategy. By highlighting indulgence, incompetence, or moral failings, the Church and its historians created a narrative that justified the transition to Carolingian rule. Kings were not simply displaced. They were depicted as unworthy, reinforcing the notion that divine and ecclesiastical approval was essential for legitimate authority. The focus on morality, rather than administrative failure alone, demonstrates how the Church used ethical judgment to shape perceptions of power, presenting the Merovingians' decline as both inevitable and righteous. This selective remembrance extended to the management of genealogical records and sacred rituals. The Merovingian sacred bloodline, though central to their authority, was mediated through church-sanctioned rituals such as coronation, baptism, and anointment. Chroniclers emphasized the religious aspects of kingship, underscoring the importance of divine favor while downplaying the hereditary or mystical elements that had previously reinforced authority. In doing so, the church subtly shifted the foundation of legitimacy. It was no longer solely the king's blood that conferred power, but the recognition of that blood through ecclesiastical approval. This reframing allowed the church to maintain influence over the dynasty, controlling the narrative of kingship even as the dynasty itself faded from practical governance. The church's manipulation of memory also had long-term cultural consequences. By canonizing certain figures and emphasizing piety over political action, ecclesiastical authorities ensured that Merovingian history would be remembered primarily as a spiritual narrative. Secular achievements, military campaigns, and administrative reforms were often minimized or omitted, leaving a historical record that foregrounded holiness rather than worldly power. This selective emphasis shaped collective memory, reinforcing the idea that the dynasty's value lay in its moral and religious significance rather than its practical authority. Even centuries later, Merovingians are often remembered less for conquest or lawmaking than for their sanctity, devotion, and alignment with the church. Yet the church's approach was not purely preservational. It also functioned as a form of control. By curating the Merovingians' legacy, the church established a framework in which kingship could be evaluated, approved, and guided. Sacred authority, once inherited and embodied, became mediated by ecclesiastical oversight. Kings were rewarded with legitimacy for piety and obedience, while deviation from moral or religious norms could be documented as evidence of unworthiness. This shift demonstrates how spiritual institutions could shape the parameters of power, embedding moral evaluation within political authority. The Merovingians' decline illustrates the effectiveness of this strategy. A dynasty whose legitimacy was once inherent had to be reframed in terms of morality and ritual, allowing the church to preserve order even as temporal power shifted. The selective memory maintained by the church also had a symbolic dimension. By emphasizing certain saints, rituals, and moral narratives, ecclesiastical authorities created a hierarchy of remembrance. Figures like Clotilde became icons of virtue, while kings like Childeric III were rendered passive, their authority neutralized through omission and ritual confinement. This manipulation of memory ensured that the Merovingian sacred lineage remained acknowledged, even as their practical influence diminished. In effect, the church maintained a delicate equilibrium. The dynasty was preserved in memory, yet stripped of the capacity to challenge the emerging order. This process illustrates a broader principle of medieval authority. The past was never neutral. Memory itself was a form of power. By controlling which events were recorded, which figures were celebrated, and which were marginalized, the church could shape perceptions of legitimacy and morality across generations. The Merovingians' fate underscores the efficacy of this approach. Even as their dynasty was politically eclipsed, its symbolic and spiritual significance was carefully curated to align with contemporary power structures. The emotional and cultural impact of this selective preservation was profound. The Merovingians remained visible as symbols of sanctity, lineage, and ritual authority. For common people, these figures represented continuity and divine favor. For nobles and officials, they served as cautionary exemplars of moral obligation and the consequences of failing to align with ecclesiastical authority. The church's curation of memory thus reinforced social and political hierarchies, shaping both contemporary governance and historical understanding. Ultimately, the church's management of Merovingian memory demonstrates the interplay between spiritual authority and historical narrative. Kings who had once ruled through sacred blood and ritual now existed primarily as moral exemplars, saints, or figures of spiritual continuity. Their political power was diminished, yet their legacy persisted through careful curation, selective remembrance, and ritualized symbolism. The Merovingian story, as preserved by the church, exemplifies how memory can be both a tool of preservation and a mechanism of control, shaping perceptions of legitimacy, morality, and authority for centuries. Through the Church's mediation, the Merovingians remained relevant long after their political influence had faded. Their sacred blood, moral exemplars, and ceremonial presence continued to inform perceptions of kingship and legitimacy. Even as their practical authority vanished, their memory endured as a powerful instrument of cultural continuity, a testament to the enduring influence of institutions that control not only the present but the narrative of the past. As the Merovingian dynasty receded from practical power, the line between history and legend became increasingly blurred. Their sacred bloodline, long hair, and ritualized authority were gradually transformed into the foundation of mythic narratives that endured for centuries. One of the most enduring legacies of this transformation is the connection between the Merovingians and the birth of Holy Grail legends. While the Grail myths are often associated with medieval romance and chivalric storytelling, their roots trace back to deeper anxieties and fascinations surrounding lineage, sacred blood, and the idea of a hidden, almost mystical inheritance. In this sense, the Grail is not merely a story of quest and heroism. It is an allegory of dynastic memory, divine authority, and the enduring allure of a bloodline that could not be fully erased. The connection between the Merovingians and Grail lore arises from the very nature of their kingship. Unlike later dynasties whose legitimacy was largely institutional, the Merovingians embodied a sacred authority, encoded in body, blood, and ritual. Their long hair was more than ornamentation. It was a visible marker of mystical power. Their ancestry, entwined with legends such as the Quinator, linked them to forces beyond ordinary human comprehension. In a society that increasingly valued Christian sanction but still remembered pre-Christian customs, these qualities made the Merovingians enigmatic figures, at once revered, feared, and mysterious. It is precisely this combination of sacred inheritance and political decline that inspired the notion of a hidden or sacred object, such as the Grail, connected to royal blood and divine favor. The Grail, in early European narratives, functions as more than a vessel or relic. It symbolizes purity, legitimacy, and the continuity of sacred authority. Scholars and mythographers have noted that in many versions, the Grail is intimately connected to bloodlines and lineage, often depicted as a vessel preserving or transmitting sacred essence. This thematic resonance mirrors the Merovingian situation, a dynasty whose authority was both inherited and mystical, whose continuity depended on blood and ritual rather than institutional endorsement. The Grail, then, can be understood as a narrative device reflecting anxieties about dynastic survival, secrecy, and the vulnerability of sacred power in a changing world. Furthermore, the association between the Merovingians and hidden bloodlines underscores the intersection of politics and spirituality. Following their deposition, Merovingian kings were confined to monasteries, removed from governance, yet their lineage persisted in both symbolic and genealogical terms. This created fertile ground for legends that emphasized secrecy, hidden heirs, and the preservation of mystical authority. The Grail myths, with their emphasis on hidden treasure, sacred inheritance, and quests to restore or recognize legitimacy, echo these historical realities in allegorical form. The lost or hidden Grail becomes a metaphor for a dynasty's obscured power, awaiting rediscovery or restoration. The process by which these myths emerged was complex and gradual. As the Carolingians consolidated power, chroniclers and storytellers began to reinterpret Merovingian traditions in ways that emphasized moral and spiritual significance while downplaying political influence. Sacred bloodlines were recast as sources of mystery and divine favor rather than instruments of authority. Stories that had once conveyed legitimacy or mystical ancestry were transformed into quests, allegories, and legendary narratives, accessible to audiences for whom the actual historical context was distant or opaque. Over time, these reinterpretations crystallized into the Grail legends, with the Merovingians' sacred lineage serving as an implicit template for the themes of hidden authority and divine sanction. The allegorical nature of the Grail also allowed for reflection on the consequences of power lost or mismanaged. Just as the Merovingians had been displaced by the Carolingians, the Grail often represents a relic of authority that has been hidden, corrupted, or rendered inaccessible. The quest for the Grail mirrors the quest for recognition, legitimacy, and restoration. A symbolic journey that resonates with the historical displacement of the Merovingians. The stories of knights seeking the Grail thus echo both the historical memory of the dynasty and the human desire to reclaim a lost connection to sacred power. Another critical element of this connection is the Grail's association with divine favor and moral testing. Merovingian kingship, deeply entwined with sacred lineage, was both a privilege and a responsibility. Kings were expected to embody moral, spiritual, and social order, just as they were expected to maintain continuity through blood and ritual. The Grail myths similarly tie the vessel or its secrets to moral virtue, emphasizing that sacred power must be recognized, honored, and preserved through worthiness. In both cases, the legitimacy of authority is conditional, tested by action, virtue, and perception, reinforcing the parallels between historical reality and allegorical narrative. The endurance of these legends also highlights the cultural fascination with hidden knowledge and concealed power. The Merovingians obscured authority, particularly after their deposition and the Carolingian consolidation, inspired speculation, imagination, and allegory. People wondered if the sacred bloodline had survived in secret, if its mystical potency remained intact, and if rightful heirs might one day reclaim authority. The Grail myths function as an imaginative exploration of these questions, embodying the tension between visible power and hidden essence, public authority and private legitimacy. Moreover, the Grail narratives serve as a lens through which later societies could interpret history, morality, and divine favor. By linking sacred vessels, hidden blood, and quests for recognition, storytellers preserved the memory of the Merovingians in a form that was morally instructive, culturally resonant, and intellectually engaging. These myths ensured that the dynasty's symbolic authority endured far beyond its political life, influencing literature, religious thought, and cultural memory for centuries. The Merovingians' legacy thus transcended chronology, entering the realm of myth and moral allegory, where it could continue to shape perceptions of kingship, legitimacy, and divine favor. In reflecting on the connection between the Merovingians and Grail lore, it becomes clear that myths are not mere entertainment. They are repositories of cultural anxiety, memory, and authority. The Grail encapsulates the human fascination with sacred lineage, hidden power, and the possibility of restoration. It mirrors the historical reality of a dynasty whose authority was once tangible yet became increasingly symbolic, whose sacred inheritance persisted even when practical power had been stripped away. In this way, the Grail functions as a narrative reflection of history itself, transforming political, ritual, and spiritual concerns into enduring allegory. Ultimately, the birth of Holy Grail myths is inseparable from the Merovingian legacy. These stories preserve the dynasty's sacred aura, its enigmatic authority, and its narrative of displacement and continuity. By tracing power through bloodlines, hidden treasures, and divine sanction, the myths illuminate the central tension of Merovingian history, the interplay between visible authority and mystical legitimacy, between political erasure and symbolic survival. The Grail becomes a vessel not only of legend but of historical memory, ensuring that the Merovingians' influence endured in the imagination long after their temporal reign had ended. Through this lens, we see that the Grail is more than a story of knights and quests. It is a meditation on the nature of power, inheritance, and legitimacy. It reflects the human longing to preserve, recognize, and restore what has been lost. And in doing so, it immortalizes the Merovingians, not as political rulers, but as symbols of sacred lineage, hidden authority, and the enduring mysteries of power that continue to captivate the imagination centuries later. As the Merovingians faded from political prominence, their story began to take on an almost mythic quality, one that merged historical events with folklore, legend, and the anxieties of a society grappling with the passage of power. One of the most fascinating elements of this transformation is the concept of hidden Merovingian heirs, children of sacred bloodline said to survive in secret, shielded from public view, and waiting for the right moment to reclaim authority. This motif of concealment and potential return reflects both historical realities and psychological needs. It preserves the aura of sacred legitimacy while explaining the dynasty's displacement. It also underscores a recurring theme in European history, the idea that bloodlines, once consecrated, can never be entirely extinguished. The notion of hidden heirs is deeply intertwined with the Merovingians' sacred ancestry. Their blood was considered not merely noble, but sanctified, connecting them to forces beyond ordinary human comprehension. Long hair, ritual practices, and even the legends of mystical progenitors like the Quinator reinforced the perception that Merovingian kings embodied a power that could not be fully transferred or replicated. With the dynasty's deposition, these qualities could not simply vanish. Human imagination, combined with the desire for continuity and legitimacy, produced narratives in which the sacred bloodline survived in secret. Such stories, circulated orally and later recorded in chronicles, served both as entertainment and as a means of negotiating the anxiety of dynastic displacement. One common narrative held that Merovingian children were spirited away to monasteries, convents, or distant lands, their existence hidden from public scrutiny. These children were sometimes described as living unrecognized among commoners or as being secretly tutored in preparation for a future reclamation of power. The theme resonates with historical precedent. After deposition, many Merovingian kings were confined to religious institutions, where they survived removed from political life. The idea that heirs could continue to live in secret, preserved by devoted guardians or hidden networks, extrapolates from these historical events to imagine a continuity of sacred blood that defied eradication. This motif also reflects broader cultural anxieties about authority and legitimacy. The Carolingian replacement of the Merovingians, though practically successful, could not entirely erase the symbolic resonance of sacred blood. By imagining hidden heirs, society acknowledged that legitimacy might exist beyond the visible exercise of power. These stories served as both reassurance and warning. Reassurance, because the sacred lineage was preserved. Warning, because the potential for restoration suggested that no usurpation, however effective, was ever absolute. The narratives implicitly questioned the permanence of political authority, revealing an awareness of the fragility of dynasties and the enduring power of symbolic legitimacy. Hidden Merovingian heirs were also deeply connected to sacred relics and symbols. In some versions of the legends, these heirs carried objects associated with the dynasty, rings, amulets, or even strands of hair that marked them as true bearers of the bloodline. These objects functioned as tangible evidence of legitimacy, linking myth to material culture. Just as the long hair of the kings symbolized sacred authority, these heirlooms served as markers of continuity, reinforcing the idea that the dynasty's power had been preserved, even in exile. The objects themselves became focal points for devotion, curiosity, and speculation, allowing the sacred lineage to persist in both imagination and reality. The notion of hidden heirs also had profound implications for social and political psychology. For nobles, advisors, and regional leaders, the idea of a surviving Merovingian heir created both hope and anxiety. Hope, because the potential restoration of sacred kingship promised legitimacy and continuity. Anxiety, because such a return could disrupt the existing order, challenge Carolingian authority, and upset carefully negotiated alliances. These stories created a tension between memory and power, reflecting the unease that arises whenever a dynasty with symbolic authority is displaced. Even without concrete evidence of surviving heirs, the possibility of their existence influenced behavior, decisions, and political calculations across generations. In literature and oral tradition, hidden Merovingian heirs often appear as mysterious figures, unaware of their true heritage, or as secret guardians of knowledge and sacred rites. Their stories emphasize the duality of visibility and concealment. They live ordinary lives, blending into society, yet their very existence represents a latent, untapped authority. The motif resonates with the broader human fascination with secret knowledge and hidden power. It suggests that true legitimacy cannot be fully extinguished. It endures in hidden channels, waiting for recognition, affirmation, or opportunity. Historically, this narrative may have been amplified by real events. Some Merovingian offspring survived deposition and lived in relative obscurity within religious institutions. Others may have been quietly integrated into other noble families, their presence recognized only by close allies. The blending of these historical possibilities with legend created fertile ground for stories of hidden heirs. Over time, the narratives became increasingly elaborate, incorporating elements of prophecy, divine favor, and mystical protection. The heirs were not merely survivors. They were symbols of hope, continuity, and the enduring potency of sacred blood. The motif of hidden Merovingian heirs also intersects with broader European concepts of messianic kingship and cyclical history. Just as other societies imagined return, restoration, or messianic figures who would reclaim authority at a crucial moment, these stories expressed a desire for justice, order, and the rectification of perceived wrongs. The Merovingians, with their mystical heritage and displaced authority, provided an ideal template for these narratives. Their concealment implied both vulnerability and invincibility. They could be removed from political life, yet the sacred blood persisted, insulated from the corruption, compromise, and decay that often accompanies public power. Additionally, hidden heirs reinforced the enduring allure of secrecy and forbidden knowledge. The notion that a sacred lineage continued unnoticed added a layer of intrigue and mystery to history itself. These stories blurred the line between historical fact and legend, inviting speculation, imagination, and moral reflection. They encouraged audiences to question the nature of legitimacy, the permanence of power, and the capacity of symbolic authority to survive erasure. In this way, the Merovingians' hidden heirs became more than a narrative device. They embodied the tension between visible and invisible power, the persistent relevance of sacred blood, and the human need to reconcile loss with hope. Ultimately, the concept of hidden Merovingian heirs demonstrates how dynasties can persist symbolically even after practical authority is removed. Through legend, ritual, and storytelling, the sacred bloodline retained its significance, influencing perceptions of legitimacy and inspiring narratives that would endure across centuries. These tales reflect both historical memory and cultural imagination, preserving the dynasty in forms that transcended politics, chronology, and mortality. The enduring fascination with hidden heirs also serves as a reminder that power is not solely exercised in the public sphere. It exists in memory, myth, and the perception of legitimacy. The Merovingians' displaced yet preserved authority, embodied in the idea of secret descendants, illustrates the complex interplay between symbolic and practical power. Even as their political influence vanished, their presence persisted in imagination and ritual, ensuring that the dynasty continued to shape European consciousness long after the last king was deposed. In exploring these hidden heirs, we encounter a profound truth about the Merovingians: that sacred authority, once encoded in blood, ritual, and myth, is remarkably resilient. It can survive deposition, exile, and erasure, manifesting in stories, objects, and symbols that endure across generations. The legends of hidden heirs preserve the memory of the dynasty's sacredness, its potential for restoration, and the enduring power of a bloodline that, though removed from thrones, continued to captivate the imagination of Europe. The fascination with hidden Merovingian heirs naturally leads to a deeper exploration of the dynasty's connection to secrecy, mystery, and esoteric knowledge. Even after their political power had been stripped away, the Merovingians maintained a symbolic presence that resonated far beyond the historical record. Their sacred lineage, intertwined with myths such as the Quinator and marked by the ceremonial significance of long hair, became the foundation for legends suggesting that they were keepers of hidden knowledge, wisdom, practices, or even relics that connected them to ancient, perhaps even pre-Christian, spiritual traditions. This concept of concealed knowledge elevated the dynasty from historical rulers to enigmatic custodians of a deeper, almost mystical order. The idea that the Merovingians possessed secret wisdom emerges from several overlapping strands of historical and mythological evidence. Their sacred bloodline implied a connection not merely to human ancestors but to forces beyond ordinary comprehension. The legends of the Quinator, along with narratives emphasizing the mystical nature of their long hair, suggested that Merovingian kings were in some sense vessels of divine or supernatural power. Such interpretations were reinforced by the Church's careful curation of history, which emphasized moral virtue while downplaying political competence. To those who remembered the old myths and the ceremonial rituals, the dynasty was not simply a line of kings but a living conduit of hidden truths, guardians of knowledge that could not be fully revealed without risk. Esoteric traditions in early medieval Europe were often closely tied to lineage. Power, wisdom, and spiritual insight were believed to pass through bloodlines, making the Merovingians uniquely positioned as inheritors of both sacred authority and ancient knowledge. This perspective helps explain why chroniclers and storytellers continued to preserve fragments of their story, even after practical power had vanished. The Merovingians' position in both ritual and narrative created a tension. They were visible yet hidden, remembered yet marginalized, their authority symbolic yet suggesting access to secrets beyond the ordinary. It is this liminal quality that gave rise to legends in which they were portrayed not merely as kings but as initiates or custodians of arcane wisdom. The association with hidden knowledge also aligns with the later development of Grail legends and esoteric traditions in Europe. In many Grail narratives, the vessel or object at the center of the story is not only sacred but also contains wisdom or power that must be protected, understood, or revealed only to the worthy. The parallels are striking. The Merovingians' mystical ancestry and ceremonial authority could be interpreted as a historical precursor to these literary devices. Just as the Grail serves as a symbol of divine knowledge accessible only to the initiated, the Merovingian sacred bloodline was imagined as a source of concealed authority and understanding, preserved in secrecy and protected from those who might misuse it. This motif of secrecy is further reinforced by the political history of the dynasty. After their deposition, Merovingian kings were often confined to monasteries or other controlled environments. These institutions functioned not merely as prisons but as carefully regulated spaces in which their authority could be contained while their symbolic presence was preserved. The isolation of deposed kings, combined with the mystique of their sacred lineage, created fertile ground for legends of hidden knowledge. Even in physical confinement, the Merovingians' aura suggested that they possessed wisdom or power that could not be extinguished. Their potential for influence became latent, existing in stories, memories, and myths rather than in overt governance. The Church played a paradoxical role in this process. While it sought to neutralize the Merovingians politically, it also preserved elements of their mystique, recognizing that their lineage carried symbolic and moral significance. By selectively recording their deeds, emphasizing piety, and carefully framing their authority, the Church maintained the aura of sacred legitimacy while limiting the dynasty's capacity for action. In doing so, it inadvertently reinforced the perception that the Merovingians possessed hidden, potentially dangerous knowledge, wisdom that was preserved in ritual, symbol, and lineage but shielded from common understanding. This delicate interplay between suppression and preservation helped sustain the aura of mystery that would persist for centuries. Merovingian involvement with esoteric knowledge was often imagined as a secretive, almost subterranean network of power and understanding. Chroniclers and later storytellers suggested that certain rituals, teachings, or objects were accessible only to those of the bloodline, implying a hereditary transmission of insight. The secrecy surrounding their lives in monasteries after deposition amplified this perception. Kings who were removed from public life yet retained ceremonial or symbolic significance became ideal figures for legends of hidden wisdom, because their physical invisibility reinforced the idea of concealed power. In other words, absence and marginalization in historical reality translated into presence and potency in myth. The narratives of hidden knowledge also intersect with European fascination with relics and sacred objects. Just as sacred vessels, amulets, and strands of hair were thought to carry power and legitimacy, the Merovingians themselves were imagined as living relics, embodying wisdom, authority, and connection to the divine. These narratives reinforced the idea that sacred authority was inseparable from knowledge. The Merovingians' preserved yet neutralized status in monasteries, coupled with the continued veneration of symbols associated with their lineage, ensured that their influence could persist in abstract, spiritual, or symbolic forms long after their political relevance had disappeared. The notion of the Merovingians as keepers of hidden knowledge also highlights the broader cultural anxiety about power, legitimacy, and continuity. Their displacement by the Carolingians created a vacuum, both practical and symbolic, that demanded explanation. Legends of secret wisdom, hidden heirs, and mystical authority provided a framework for understanding why the Merovingians remained significant despite their political marginalization. These narratives allowed society to reconcile the apparent disappearance of a sacred dynasty with the enduring cultural memory of their power. In essence, the myths functioned as both historical interpretation and imaginative resolution, preserving the significance of the dynasty while acknowledging the practical realities of its fall. Even in modern interpretations, the Merovingians are often framed as enigmatic, almost conspiratorial figures. Writers and researchers have speculated on their connections to secret societies, hidden texts, and ancient rituals, exploring the idea that their influence extended beyond visible rule. While much of this is speculative, it reflects a continuity of perception. The Merovingians, by virtue of their sacred lineage, ritualized authority, and ceremonial mystique, were uniquely positioned to inspire narratives of concealed knowledge that endure to this day. Their historical reality, a combination of inherited authority, symbolic presence, and political decline, created fertile ground for stories that merge history with myth, fact with speculation, and power with mystery. Ultimately, the perception of the Merovingians as custodians of hidden knowledge illustrates the enduring tension between visible authority and symbolic influence. Though their political power had been neutralized, the dynasty retained significance through myth, ritual, and the imagination of subsequent generations. Their long hair, sacred lineage, and ceremonial roles became markers of something more profound than kingship alone: the possibility of knowledge, insight, and authority that could be preserved, transmitted, and activated under the right conditions. The dynasty's historical erasure was thus partial. While their governance ended, their aura, and the perception of hidden wisdom continued to captivate and inspire. In exploring the Merovingians as custodians of hidden knowledge, we see how the interplay of ritual, lineage, and myth can preserve influence beyond the reach of conventional power. Their story demonstrates that authority is not only enacted but also imagined, remembered, and encoded into symbols, narratives, and traditions. The Merovingians' legacy, in this sense, extends far beyond the reign of any individual king. It endures in the collective imagination, in the notion that sacred blood carries not only legitimacy but the potential for hidden insight, wisdom, and power that can survive centuries of political displacement. The enduring mystique of the Merovingian dynasty is inseparable from the interplay of bloodline, power, and secrecy, a combination that gave rise to centuries of speculation, legend, and intrigue. Even as the last long-haired kings were deposed, their symbolic authority persisted, preserved not in practical rule but in myth, ritual, and the imagination of chroniclers, nobles, and common people alike. This persistence created fertile ground for conspiratorial thinking, secret societies, and the idea that the Merovingians were custodians of hidden knowledge and esoteric power, a theme that would echo through European thought for centuries. The concept of secrecy surrounding the Merovingians can be traced to multiple historical and cultural factors. Their sacred bloodline, long associated with mystical forces, suggested that they possessed qualities beyond ordinary kings. The legend of the Quinator, their long hair as a visible emblem of authority, and the ritualized aspects of their kingship all contributed to the perception that the Merovingians were more than mere rulers. They were living symbols of a transcendent authority that could not be fully explained, controlled, or replicated. These qualities made the dynasty simultaneously revered and feared, creating a tension that naturally lent itself to stories of hidden knowledge and clandestine power. Following their deposition, this aura of secrecy only intensified. With Childeric III confined to a monastery, the line between historical fact and imaginative interpretation blurred. The Merovingians were no longer active participants in politics, yet their presence remained in chronicles, genealogies, relics, and ritual memory. The juxtaposition of political invisibility and enduring symbolic authority fueled narratives, in which the dynasty retained secret influence, hidden heirs, and knowledge passed down through bloodlines. Monastic confinement, intended to neutralize practical authority, paradoxically amplified the dynasty's mystique by removing kings from public scrutiny while preserving their sacred identity. The fascination with hidden power also intersected with the development of European esotericism. Throughout the Middle Ages, Legends emerged connecting the Merovingians to secret wisdom, sacred relics, and mystical practices. Their supposed possession of hidden knowledge was often linked to their divine or semi-divine ancestry, suggesting that they were not merely rulers but initiates of deeper mysteries. Chroniclers and storytellers preserved fragments of these ideas, portraying the Merovingians as gatekeepers of truth, ritual, and lineage that extended beyond the ordinary comprehension of the population. These narratives elevated the dynasty from historical actors to symbols of esoteric authority. The idea of secret power was reinforced by the tangible remnants of the Merovingians' influence. Coins, seals, relics, and architectural motifs, all embedded with symbolic meaning, served as physical reminders of the dynasty's sacred authority. Even as practical rule passed to the Carolingians, these objects persisted in circulation and memory, silently asserting legitimacy and continuity. Objects associated with the dynasty, whether strands of hair, rings, or ceremonial regalia, were interpreted as repositories of power, reinforcing the belief that the Merovingians were more than figures of history. They were conduits of hidden forces. In this way, material culture and myth merged, creating a layered narrative of visible absence and invisible potency. The narratives of hidden heirs, secret knowledge, and mystical influence also reveal the human desire for continuity and restoration. The Merovingians' displacement created a vacuum both political and symbolic, and imagination filled that gap with stories of concealed authority and latent power. These tales often depicted heirs living incognito, preserved in monasteries, or secretively instructed in wisdom and ritual. The motif of hidden heirs reflects a longing for the restoration of sacred authority, a cultural attempt to reconcile the visible absence of power with the enduring perception of legitimacy. It also illustrates the tension between historical reality and narrative interpretation. The dynasty had been politically neutralized, yet its symbolic presence persisted in stories, imagination, and ritual memory. The enduring speculations surrounding the Merovingians also intersected with ideas about prophecy and destiny. Medieval and later European thought frequently posited that sacred bloodlines carried not only authority but also the potential for restoration. Hidden Merovingians, in legends, were often associated with apocalyptic or transformative narratives, suggesting that their reemergence could restore order or reveal truths lost to time. Such stories reinforced the perception that power, legitimacy, and wisdom were inseparable from lineage, and that bloodlines could carry consequences far beyond immediate rule. The narrative of a hidden, waiting Merovingian heir embodies both hope and caution, reflecting anxieties about the consequences of erasing sacred authority and the enduring potency of symbolic legitimacy. Esoteric speculation around the Merovingians extended into philosophical and religious discourse. Thinkers and chroniclers pondered the implications of a bloodline whose authority was inherently mystical. How could sacred kingship be reconciled with Christian doctrine? How might hidden heirs influence the moral and political order? These questions were not merely literary. They reflected a society negotiating the boundaries of divine authority, secular power, and lineage. In this sense, the Merovingians functioned as a lens through which people could explore broader questions about legitimacy, morality, and the intersection of visible and invisible influence. The persistence of Merovingian mystique also shaped later historical interpretation. Renaissance and modern writers, fascinated by the idea of hidden bloodlines, often speculated on secret societies, mystical knowledge, and conspiracies connected to the dynasty. While these ideas are largely legendary, they are grounded in the historical reality of a line of kings whose sacred and symbolic authority outlasted their political relevance. The dynasty's enigmatic qualities, mythic ancestry, ritualized kingship, and symbolic presence, created fertile ground for centuries of speculation about hidden influence and esoteric power. Moreover, the Merovingians' connection to secrecy reflects a broader pattern in human history. When authority is displaced, symbolic and mythical interpretations often arise to preserve legitimacy and meaning. The dynasty's sacred blood, long associated with mystical ancestry and ritualized kingship, provided a narrative scaffold upon which stories of hidden heirs, secret wisdom, and clandestine power could be constructed. These stories were not arbitrary. They reflected social memory, cultural anxiety, and the enduring need to reconcile loss, displacement, and the persistence of symbolic authority. Ultimately, the legends of hidden Merovingian power demonstrate that authority is multifaceted. Kings may lose practical control, yet their symbolic and mystical presence can persist in memory, ritual, and imagination. The combination of sacred lineage, ceremonial authority, and historical erasure created a unique tension. The dynasty was simultaneously neutralized and omnipresent, absent and influential. The fascination with secrecy, hidden heirs, and esoteric knowledge reflects the enduring power of symbols, the human need for continuity, and the capacity of myth to preserve authority even when political structures change. Through these narratives, the Merovingians transcend conventional history. They are no longer solely kings. They are symbols of hidden authority, latent potential, and the enduring potency of sacred blood. Their story illustrates the ways in which dynasties can persist in imagination, ritual, and legend, influencing perceptions of legitimacy, morality, and power long after their practical reign has ended. In this sense, the Merovingians' mystical aura, entwined with secrecy and hidden influence, ensures that their legacy remains a compelling, enigmatic, and enduring element of European historical consciousness.